In the quiet hills and plains where early Indian traditions gathered, a figure named Siddhartha Gautama walked a path that would become a turning point for countless lives across centuries and continents. He was born into royalty, sheltered within the palace walls of Kapilavastu, a world of privilege that promised safety and plenty but little freedom from the questions that stir every human heart. What is the purpose of life? Why does suffering exist? Is happiness something we can hold on to, or does it slip away just as wealth and beauty do? The stories tell us that he tasted both extremes, the indulgence of luxury and the harsh rigor of ascetic denial, before finally sitting with a simple bowl of alms and a steadfast resolve to understand suffering not as a personal misfortune, but as a condition that can be seen, understood, and transformed. The awakening that followed was not a single flash of insight so much as a sustained, patient clearing away of misperceptions. It was the dawning realization that suffering arises not only from events outside us, but from the way the mind grasps, craves, and fixes itself to impermanent things. This awakening is spoken of in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the first formal proclamation of the Buddha's teaching after his awakening. It is there, in a deliberately simple cadence, that the Four Noble Truths are named, explained, and offered as a path rather than as a creed. The Buddha did not present a new God or a new metaphysical system so much as a diagnosis of the human condition, and crucially, a map for living with clarity within it. The sutta begins with a recognition that is intimate to every human being: life includes suffering. The Buddha says, with a calm insistence that invites presence rather than defense, now this is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is not dear is suffering. Separation from what is dear is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In short, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. He then adds the mirror that shows us how suffering persists and how it might be loosened. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. Craving, which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by the craving and longing for pleasures, and craving for becoming and non-becoming. And he points toward release. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. The complete extinction of craving. Finally, he names the way. This is the noble truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the noble Eightfold Path. In those few lines one finds not a doctrine about God or about karma and abstraction, but a practical invitation to observe, understand, and slowly transform the patterns of mind that create unease and dissatisfaction. To listen to these truths as a modern listener is not to sign up for a distant monastic standard, but to notice how our own lives echo them. We see suffering not merely as bad luck, but as a result of the way we habitually relate to experience. We cling to pleasurable feelings, we defend against discomfort, we rewrite events so that they fit a preferred story, and we neglect the moment-to-moment realities of being present. The Four Noble Truths are a grammar for seeing these patterns with enough clarity to loosen their grip. They invite us into a form of practice that blends insight, moral discipline, and mental training, an approach that does not pretend to remove the world's hardships, but to change the way we inhabit them. The Eightfold Path that the Buddha offers is not a rigid prescription, but a flexible framework that can be translated into everyday life. It is often described as a spectrum weaving together wisdom, panna, ethical conduct, sila, and mental discipline, samadhi. The aim is not to reduce life to a list of duties, but to cultivate a way of seeing and acting that diminishes craving and its sequelae. We begin with right view, a recognizing of the nature of reality as interdependent, contingent, and empty of a fixed, unchanging self. This is not a philosophical assertion designed to win debates. It is a stance that gradually reframes our judgments, dissolves black and white thinking, and opens space for compassion and clarity. Right view invites a novice practitioner to notice how the self inflates with certainty when confronted by ambiguous situations, to see that others' motives, like our own, are complex and often concealed by habit and fear. Next comes right intentions, the cultivation of attitudes that align with wisdom rather than impulsive craving. It is an ethical temper, a decision to choose the long view over the immediate lure of reward, to commit to intention that reduces harm rather than indulges in self-justifying narratives. Right speech asks us to slow the tongue as much as the mind slows the breath, to choose words that heal rather than wound, to replace rumor, sarcasm, and harsh judgment with careful, truthful, and kind expression. Right action and right livelihood translate that same ethic into concrete behavior and daily work. Ethical conduct becomes visible not only in what we refrain from doing, killing, stealing, lying, but in what we actively do. Helping others, keeping commitments, and choosing work that aligns with values rather than merely profits or prestige. Right livelihood calls for a career and a mode of earning that do not create needless harm, that respect others' dignity, and that contribute to the common good rather than merely the accumulation of personal gain. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration complete the triad of mental training. Right effort involves cultivating wholesome states of mind while discouraging unwholesome ones, a careful balance of diligence and gentleness toward oneself. Right mindfulness anchors attention in moments of present experience, breath, body, feelings, and mind, without clinging or aversion, a practice that gradually rewires attention away from automatic reactivity. Right concentration deepens that focused attention into steadiness, a calm center from which insight can arise. Taken together, these 8 steps are often translated into tangible life applications. A morning routine that begins with noting intentions rather than fueling an immediate craving. Decisions about purchases softened by mindful pause. Conversations infused with listening and restraint. Work that treats colleagues as ends in themselves rather than as means to an external success metric. To connect these teachings to lived experience, we can begin with the reality of craving in everyday life. Consider money. In our time, money often promises security, status, even identity. The craving for more money may arise not as a simple desire but as a narrative that equates wealth with worth, control with safety, and novelty with happiness. We may tell stories like, if I had one more raise, I would finally be free, or if I can buy that car, upgrade that apartment, or invest in that stock, I will prove to myself and others that I am competent, desirable, and secure. Yet the Eightfold Path invites a different stance. Right view asks us to see money as a tool, neither inherently good nor evil, whose value is measured by its use. Right intentions cautions against grasping at it as the sole source of security or meaning. Right speech and right action encourage honesty about our financial needs and responsibilities, while avoiding deception, manipulation, or exploitation in pursuit of gain. Right mindfulness helps us notice the moment when a purchase is driven by fear or pride rather than necessity or clarity. And right concentration supports the patient, long-term planning that resists impulsive splurges in favor of sustainable, ethical decisions. Craving also manifests in status, the hunger for social recognition, prestige, and the apparent validation that comes from external signs of success. Many modern lives are structured to calibrate self-worth against the number of followers, the degree earned, the job title, the house in a certain neighborhood. The Buddha's teaching does not condemn ambition in itself. It asks us to examine the underlying motive and the shadow side of aspiration, the fear of being ordinary, the discomfort of not being seen, the tendency to compare and compete. The Eightfold Path, interpreted in daily terms, helps reframe status from a primary aim to a byproduct of a life that pursues clarity, compassion, and responsibility. Right view acknowledges that status is a reflection of social dynamics and personal actions, not a fixed essence of who we are. Right intention invites a motive of non-harm and generosity. Right speech, action, and livelihood encourage a stance in which success is measured not by prominence, but by how one contributes to the well-being of others. Right mindfulness fosters a habit of noticing when the pursuit of status crowds out other values, and right concentration can be employed to sustain the energy needed for meaningful work rather than chasing ephemeral applause. A third area of craving is relationship, the pull toward attachment to people as a way of securing happiness, safety, or identity. We all know the seductive pull of craving for approval, fear of rejection, or longing for the perfect partner or perfect family. The bodhi mind, cultivated through the Eightfold Path, can illuminate the way we relate to others by shifting the focus from fixated outcomes to present, compassionate, and honest engagement. Right view recognizes the interdependent nature of beings. Right intention cultivates goodwill. Right speech invites honest and kind communication. Right action and livelihood guide ethical behavior in the small acts of daily life and large commitments alike. Right mindfulness helps us see that relationships are not possessions to be curated but dynamic processes that require continual care. Right concentration sustains the patience needed to listen deeply, to respond rather than react, and to hold space for differences without dissolving one's own boundaries. If craving for relationships can be nuanced into a path of more generous presence, the path also invites us to consider mindfulness as a practice that changes outcomes in the mundane and the consequential. We can look at 2 additional domains: mindful consumption and ethical decision-making in work or study. Mindful consumption invites a conscious slowing of the impulse to consume beyond necessity or to chase novelty habitually. It involves asking questions before purchase. Is this thing a need or a want? Will it cause environmental or social harm? Does it align with what I value now, or does it merely reinforce a fleeting mood or social pressure? The Eightfold Path translates into concrete habits here. Right view recognizes the environmental and social footprint of our choices. Right intention aligns consumption with values like simplicity, gratitude, and care for others. Right speech avoids boastful, judgmental, or wasteful talk about possessions. Right action and right livelihood encourage responsible production and consumption. Right mindfulness keeps us aware of the moment of consumption, the desires that fuel it, and the consequences that follow. Right concentration can cultivate the patience to resist impulse and to cultivate long-term contentment. In the realm of ethical decision-making in work or study, the Eightfold Path becomes a living code for integrity and responsibility. Right view prompts us to consider the broader impact of our decisions. Does this choice harm others, or does it contribute to a fair and sustainable outcome? Right intention asks for prudence, benevolence, and honesty in our motives, resisting rationalizations that justify harm for convenience. Right speech guides how we advocate for our ideas, provide constructive critique, and avoid deception or insinuation. Right action and right livelihood require alignment between our professed values and our daily tasks, ensuring that work serves life rather than erodes it. Right effort, mindfulness, and concentration provide the stamina to persist in ethical inquiry, to notice biases and blind spots, and to cultivate a steadier, more reflective professional practice. In this way, the Buddha's framework moves beyond a doctrinal system into a mode of living that makes a difference in concrete contexts. It invites us to translate ancient terms into modern decisions, to carry the weight of wisdom into everyday life without sacrificing the empathy that makes moral life possible. The three marks of existence, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not-self, offer another lens through which to understand our experience. Impermanence, or anicca, is not a gloomy fatalism, but a recognition of change as the ever-present condition of life. If nothing endures, then clinging to the idea that any one moment, relationship, thing, or status can deliver lasting security is an invitation to disappointment. Yet it is precisely in the awareness of impermanence that freedom can begin. We are invited to cherish rather than grasp, to invest in the present moment with gratitude rather than to squeeze it for future certainty. The second mark, unsatisfactoriness or dukkha, is not simply about pain or sorrow. It is about the subtle dissatisfaction that accompanies craving and the belief that satisfaction lies in the next achievement, the next possession, the next status upgrade. The mindful response to dukkha is not resignation, but a mature attention that transforms the quality of experience. By noticing the arising, lingering, and passing of feelings and cravings, we begin to loosen their grip. The third mark, not self or anatta, presents perhaps the most radical shift. There is no fixed, independent me behind the experiences of mind and body. As the Anattalakkhana Sutta conveys, the Buddha teaches that the sense of self arises from a misperception of the flux of experience. In this realization, there is a release from the absolute bosses of identity that often sustain fear, defensiveness, and grievance. To glimpse not-self is not to surrender agency, but to release the misperceived backbone of personal debt and duty. The result is a more flexible sense of responsibility, a way of engaging with others and the world that is less possessed by ego and more oriented toward interdependence and care. To place these teachings in a historical frame helps us see why they arose in a particular time and culture, and how they relate to broader currents in Indian religious and philosophical thought. In the centuries before and after the Buddha's lifetime, the Indian landscape was a mosaic of Brahmanical orthodoxy, ascetic movements, and a variety of philosophical schools. The Brahmanical tradition spoke of ritual, cosmic order, and the self's relationship to ultimate reality, often expressed through the concept of Atman, the enduring self, and a world of duties and duties fulfilled through yajna and discipline. The Upanishadic turn within that milieu began to ask what the self is and how liberation might be achieved. Jainism and other ascetic currents emphasized renunciation, strict ethics, and nonviolence as the path to purification and liberation. Against this background, the Buddha offered a distinct critique and a practical path. He did not emphasize ritual authority, nor did he hinge salvation on the discovery of a metaphysical self. Instead, he proposed a diagnostic framework, suffering's truth as it appears in daily life, and a method for transformation that could be practiced by lay people as well as Aryans, monks as well as ladychurs. The historical context is reinforced by canonical texts that have shaped how the early Buddhist community understood the world. The Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is sometimes considered the formal moment when the Buddha set out his core teaching for a broad audience. It sits beside a broader collection of discourses in the early Nikayas, Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, that record the Buddha's conversations with kings, monks, merchants, and lay followers. These texts reveal not only ethical and soteriological aims, but also epistemological commitments, a practice of inquiry, of discernment, of testing claims against the direct experience of suffering, its cravings, and their cessation. The early Nikayas portray a community that is both pragmatic and contemplative, balancing social responsibilities with a cultivated inner life. They show how the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path were not abstract ideas, but living instructions for people negotiating hunger, fear, love, ambition, illness, death, friendship, and conflict. The historical threads also invite cross-cultural and cross-tradition dialogue. From the Vedanta tradition, we hear the contrast between the Buddha's not-self and the Advaitic idea of a singular, eternal self or ground of being. Vedanta's central claim about ultimate reality, as Brahman and the Atman's relation to it, presents a stark contrast to Buddhist epistemology and metaphysics, and the Buddha's critique of an eternal, unchanging self invites a conversation about what counts as real and how the self is constituted by phenomena that are interdependent and impermanent. Jainism's emphasis on the sanctity and purity of every life, the vitality of ascetic practices, and the moral gravity of nonviolence provides a different map for ethics and liberation, one that shares with Buddhism concern for the consequences of action and a disciplined path of purification, yet diverges on the nature of self and the means to perfection. The Buddha's approach to moral life, meanwhile, offers a bridge to secular moral psychology and modern cognitive science. Stoicism and Aristotelian ethics, with their emphases on virtue, rational agency, and the cultivation of character, resonate with Buddhist aims to form wise, compassionate, and resilient persons. The broader philosophical chorus thus includes not only Eastern traditions, but a Western lineage of virtue ethics and cognitive appraisal that can illuminate how mindfulness affects attention, emotion regulation, and behavior. This cross-referencing is not merely a scholarly exercise. It helps illuminate how Buddhist practice can be understood in a broad intellectual and practical context. When we listen to prompts for right view or right mindfulness, we can hear echoes of Stoic admonitions to examine impressions and to differentiate what is within our control from what is not. When we consider the idea of not-self, we encounter a radical, insistent question about personal identity that has resonances with certain strands of contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science. How much of the self is a narrative and a construct, and how does that framework influence moral responsibility? The Eightfold Path, viewed through a modern lens, offers a cognitive model as well as an ethical one. It invites us to regulate attention, reframe belief, recalibrate intention, and align actions with broader, more inclusive aims. The Buddha's life story, the Great Renunciation, the Deer Park Sermon, and the subsequent spread of his teaching provides vivid historical anchors that illuminate the philosophical content in a human, narrative form. The Great Renunciation is the turning moment when Siddhartha leaves behind a life of ease, royal protection, and possible dynastic security to seek an end to suffering through spiritual practice. It is not simply a dramatic anecdote, it signals a decision to test the claims of tradition through personal effort. It is a reminder that philosophical life is inseparable from personal risk, from stepping away from inherited certainties in order to discover whether they hold in the furnace of experience. The Deer Park Sermon, delivered after years of wandering and practice, marks a moment of public articulation, when the Buddha frames the teaching in a discourse that invites others into an inquiry, not a dogmatic allegiance. The image of a circle of monks gathered, listening, reflecting, and after listening, choosing a path of practice, is a humanizing reminder that philosophy is also a shared life, a conversation between teachers and students, between seekers and a community that sustains them. We also have a historical note to consider. As the Buddhist movement found itself in new political and cultural soils, Ashoka the Great played a pivotal role in shaping Buddhist ethics beyond the monastic community. Ashoka's edicts, carved on distant rocks and pillars, present a vision of policy informed by Dharma that sought to harmonize governance with compassion, moral restraint, and welfare. The empire-sized diffusion of Buddhist values under Ashoka suggests that the ethical teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path could be translated into political life, social reform, and efforts toward nonviolence, religious toleration, and public welfare. The arching thread from a personal awakening to a public ethic shows how a spiritual insight can become a moral program for communities and institutions across borders and centuries. As we move from narrative to interpretation, it is natural to turn toward two important questions that often arise in thoughtful engagement with Buddhism. First, the critique that the Eightfold Path can appear prescriptive or culturally specific, and second, the challenge that the not-self doctrine poses for personal identity and moral responsibility. The first critique asks whether a framework that enumerates 8 set duties may feel like a checklist that imposes a particular cultural practice and social order. Critics worry that what counts as ethical conduct or what counts as right in different times and places may be too tethered to a specific historical milieu. The response is twofold. 1. The Eightfold Path is cast not as a rigid legal code, but as a flexible map designed to be interpreted in light of time, place, and intention. The second is to recognize that the path invites ongoing inquiry. Right view can be deepened through study of the early suttas, reflection on personal experience, and dialogue with others. Right speech and right action can be practiced with discernment and humility, acknowledging that what is right in one moment may require adaptation in another. The teaching's strength lies in its openness to transformation, not in its compactness as a static list. The path remains a living discipline that invites experimentation, rather than a dogmatic outline that demands compliance. The second critique, the not-self doctrine, similarly invites careful thought. If the self is not a fixed essence, what does this mean for personal identity and responsibility? Does it dissolve accountability, or does it reframe accountability in terms of relational responsibility, interdependence, and a less ego-driven sense of agency? The Buddhist response is not to erase moral choice, but to recast it in a way that reduces the reactivity and stubbornness that often accompany self-centered living. If there is no permanent self under the flux of experiences, then harm caused by one person to another is a harm carried within a web of dependent relations. Responsibility becomes less about defending a fixed self and more about sustaining conditions that allow well-being to emerge for all beings. The not-self view thus does not erase moral seriousness. Rather, it invites a compassionate consideration of how one's actions ripple through a field of interrelated lives. And in modern contexts, it resonates with psychological findings that show how fixed self-views can trap people in unhelpful patterns, while flexible, interdependent conceptions of self align with adaptive decision-making and increased prosocial behavior. To widen the frame further, it is instructive to connect the Buddha's approach to other grand traditions and disciplines. Vedanta's emphasis on unity and the ultimate nature of reality presents a challenging counterpoint to the Buddhist insistence on dependent origination and not self, yet both traditions place the aim of liberation, wisdom, and ethical life at their center. Jainism offers another counterpoint with its rigorous ethics of nonviolence and purification through asceticism, while differing in its metaphysical commitments about self and soul. Stoicism, with its imperative to live in accord with nature and to exercise control over one's impressions, provides a secular resonance with Buddhist attention to the workings of mind and the cultivation of virtue. Aristotle's virtue ethics, with its emphasis on character and practical wisdom, phronses, offers a complementary vocabulary for thinking about the cultivation of a well-ordered life that can integrate with Buddhist practice in meaningful ways. In contemporary cognitive science, mindfulness research reveals mechanisms by which training attention and contextual appraisal can modulate emotional response and attention networks in the brain, offering empirical language to some of the terms used in traditional Buddhist psychology. The cross-pollination offered by these dialogues, Vedanta, Jainism, Stoicism, Aristotelian ethics, and cognitive science, opens pathways for people who are drawn to Buddhism but come with different intellectual training, life histories, or cultural backgrounds. In doing so, we must also remain mindful of the historical anecdotes that have long sustained Buddhist imagination. The Great Renunciation is not merely a dramatic moment in a biography. It is a narrative about choosing inquiry and responsibility over comfortable but potentially stultifying certainty. The Deer Park sermon dramatizes the Buddha's return to a listening community and his willingness to present the path as a practice rather than a metaphysical guarantee. These episodes remind us that philosophy, in its most meaningful form, is a shared, ongoing conversation in which teachers and students co-create meaning through practice, reflection, and mutual care. And the note on Ashoka shows how an ethical vision can scale, a political order sustained not by coercion, but by a cultivated moral sensibility that reaches into law, governance, public welfare, and interreligious harmony. These stories anchor abstract ideas in history and in the lived experiences of communities that valued health, freedom from fear, and the flourishing of life in harmony with one another. Beyond history, the Buddha's teaching invites two kinds of cross-referenced exploration that can enrich a modern program of study and practice. First, a dialogue with non-Buddhist frameworks about self, mind, and virtue can illuminate the strengths and limits of each approach. The Vedantic emphasis on the oneness of experience can be seen as a compelling foil to the Buddhist insistence on not-self, inviting a deeper inquiry into how we understand the relation between unity and multiplicity. Jainism's rigorous ethical program invites questions about ecological responsibility and nonviolence that remain pressing in today's world. The second cross-reference is secular. The shared ground with Stoicism and Aristotelian ethics, which address how to live well amid external constraints and how to shape one's character through rational, deliberate practice. When we hear mindfulness described in the laboratory of modern cognitive science, we are not simply translating an ancient practice into neurology. We are engaging in a conversation about how attention, emotion, and behavior can be shaped through intentional training, social support, and lifelong learning. As we close this exploration, it is helpful to glance toward an outline for expanding into a more robust, approximately 5,000-word treatment that ties practice to philosophy, culture, and personal life. Such an expansion might begin with a deeper historical introduction, a careful mapping of the intellectual and religious landscape of early India, including the emergence of the Suddic tradition, the role of monastic communities, and the social and political dimensions of the Buddha's outreach. It could proceed to a careful, text-based analysis of the Four Noble Truths as they appear in multiple suttas, tracing how different discourses highlight various aspects of suffering, craving, cessation, and path. A third thread would be a more granular, practice-oriented exegesis of the Eightfold Path with real-life exemplars and guided exercises drawn from contemporary contexts: family life, education, workplace ethics, technology use, climate concerns, and social justice work. A fourth thread would be a careful examination of the three marks of existence with illustrative case studies that show how impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not-self manifest in relationships, work, and decision-making. A fifth thread would be a robust, critical dialogue with Vedanta, Jainism, Stoicism, and Aristotelian ethics, with a set of cross-reference charts and comparative readings to guide students through the similarities, tensions, and productive overlaps. A sixth thread would be an engagement with modern cognitive science and psychology, presenting research on mindfulness, attention, emotion regulation, and resilience, while also acknowledging limitations, questions, and areas where experiential practice exceeds what empirical studies can presently capture. A seventh thread could explore the cultural translations of Buddhist practice across continents, how the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path have been adapted in various languages, communities, and institutional settings, while preserving core aims. An eighth thread would be a personal life section, exercises for daily practice, journaling prompts, guided dialogues for ethical decision-making, and reflective essays that connect the philosophy to readers' own biographies. And a final thread would be a closing meditation, a compassionate invitation to begin again wherever one stands, recognizing that a life of practice is not a destination, but a steady, unfolding conversation with the world's joys, sorrows, and uncertainties. To give a sense of the living texture of this philosophy, consider two further real-life examples that illuminate the pedagogy of mindful response. The first involves a moment in which a person receives a sudden financial windfall and must choose whether to celebrate extravagantly or to pause, reflect, and channel gain toward life-affirming, long-term aims. The individual might practice right view by acknowledging that wealth is not an absolute secure anchor, but a dependent, responsive condition that can dissolve or expand one's capacity to help others. The corresponding right intention would steer one away from pride or fear, toward gratitude, generosity, and prudent stewardship. Right speech might involve sharing the news carefully to avoid inflaming envy or spreading rumor, while right action could guide charitable giving or investment choices that respect others and the environment. Mindfulness helps notice the impulse to buy more, to flaunt status, or to react in fear, so that actions align with values. Concentration supports the patience to discern what is truly needed and what would simply feed craving. The second example might involve a complex professional decision, say, a researcher on a grant committee deciding whether to fund a project that promises significant impact but involves uncertain long-term risks to participants. Here, right view prompts a careful assessment of what is known, what remains uncertain, and how risk is distributed among stakeholders. Right intention fosters humility and distributive justice. Right speech encourages precise, honest communication with colleagues and the public. Right action and right livelihood require not merely the professional feasibility of the project, but its alignment with ethical commitments to non-harm and social good. Right effort helps sustain a rigorous but compassionate approach to evaluation, while right mindfulness keeps the committee anchored in present realities and the needs of participants. Right concentration provides the steadiness to hold competing values in tension and to seek a decision that honors the dignity of all involved. To bring this long arc into conversation with readers and viewers, we can also lean on echoes from primary sources. The words of the Buddha, even when translated and interpreted through centuries of discourse, carry a particular cadence, a balance between the hard work of attention and the soft, patient cultivation of compassion. The Four Noble Truths are not simply a catalog of facts, they are a lived invitation to observe, transform, and share the light of understanding with others. When we hear the sentence from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, "Now this is the noble truth of suffering," we are reminded that the path begins with clear seeing rather than heroic certainty. When the Eightfold Path is presented as the path for the cessation of suffering, not a ritual path to authentication, we hear a call to responsibility, to turn insight into action and action into care in small and large ways alike. When the three marks are framed as a continuous meditation on change, unsatisfactoriness, and the absence of fixed self, the invitation becomes to live with more flexibility, more truth-telling, and more love for one another. As this narrative turns toward its close in this segment, it is useful to return to the image of a life that is not merely a theoretical system but a practice, a way and a habit of living that gradually reorients the heart and the mind toward a more generous and grounded form of existence. The Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the three marks together offer a map for attending to the tensions that arise in every life. The tension between longing and receipt, between aspiration and restraint, between the desire for permanence and the reality of flux. The historical life of the Buddha, the early Buddhist communities documented in the Nikayas, and the later diffusion of Buddhist ethics across empires all testify to a wisdom that can travel beyond time and place while remaining intimate to the needs of every human life, the need to find ways to endure without being hardened, to awaken without becoming detached, to live with clarity and care within a world that is always, in some sense, in motion. In the end, the path invites us to experiment with our own ways of practice, to notice what arises in craving, to examine its origin, and to explore a response that acknowledges the truth of impermanence, the reality of unsatisfactoriness, and the presence of a mind that can learn, adapt, and choose anew. The practice is not merely to endure but to transform, soundly, slowly, and with compassion. It asks for patient steps, a morning pause to observe the breath and the mood, a conversation in which we speak with truth and kindness, a decision-making process that weighs long-term consequences alongside immediate needs, a habit of reflective reading and listening that widens the circle of care. If you're drawn to this tradition and wish to explore further, you might begin by turning to the primary texts themselves, reading the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta with care, listening for the cadence that invites inquiry rather than instruction. You could study the Anattalakkhana Sutta to deepen your understanding of not-self and the way the mind projects a sense of a fixed I into experience. You might also explore the Dhammapada's concise exhortations, such as the line commonly translated as "all conditioned things are unsatisfactory." Strive on with diligence to reflect on how contentment is cultivated through persistent practice rather than passive acceptance. You could cross-reference with the Vedantic questions about the ultimate nature of reality, the Jain insistence on nonviolence and purification, and the Western tradition's virtues-based poetics through Stoicism and Aristotle. You could juxtapose these with modern cognitive science, reading empirical studies on mindfulness and attention regulation alongside personal practice. Finally, you can begin to map out your own expansion of this project, building a fuller, deeper, and more interactive exploration that links philosophy to culture, to communities, and to the intimate life of daily choices. An expanded treatment might offer sections that delve into the anthropology of early Buddhist communities, a richer survey of suttas that treat ethics and psychology in different registers, an accessible guide to the practice of mindfulness in everyday settings, and a set of reflective exercises rooted in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. It could include interviews with practitioners across traditions, critical essays that examine tensions with surrounding philosophies, and a practical appendix that translates the teachings into contemporary language for students, policymakers, healthcare professionals, artists, and ordinary people seeking a more peaceful and purposeful life. There is, in this teaching, a patient invitation to a form of life in which wisdom and compassion are not abstractions, but everyday practices. The Four Noble Truths invite us to see the truth of suffering with honesty. The Eightfold Path offers a sophisticated, humane method of meeting that truth with discernment, care, and patient training. The three marks remind us that impermanence, dissatisfaction, and not-self are not threats to be defeated, but realities to be known with clarity and tenderness. The historical path of the Buddha, his awakening, and the early communities that carried his message into different climates show us that such a life is not merely possible, but lived, through renunciation when necessary, through conversation and teaching, through the steady work of turning insight into action in every corner of life. If we listen with the intention to apply this knowledge, we may find that the meditation on suffering is not a grim meditation on pain but a hopeful one. A way to recognize what is real in our experience without clinging to it, to respond to the world with more skill and more care, and to cultivate a steadiness of mind that can guard against the impulses that lead to harm and regret. In that light, the Four Noble Truths are not ancient doctrine but a practical invitation to look at our lives honestly, to live more fully with the uncertainties of existence, and to develop a form of freedom that is not the avoidance of trouble, but the resilient, compassionate capacity to meet trouble with wisdom. The path is patient, the work is ongoing, and the possibility of transformation remains, as it has for centuries, a living flame in the human quest for clarity, kindness, and peace. Close your eyes for a moment and listen as if you are listening to your own breath. In Buddhist thought, the things we grasp at as solid and real, our bodies, the chair we sit on, the stories we tell about who we are not fixed, self-contained islands. They are events in a web of dependence, conditions unfolding, causes and effects weaving together. This is not an abstract puzzle so much as a practice of seeing clearly. If you slow down and look, you might notice that the chair you lean against is not an independent thing with an essence of its own. It is a nexus of parts, functions, and relations: wood, screws, a design for sitting, a shelf for your mug, a history of manufacture and use. The more you pry, the more you see that the chair exists only in a certain constellation of causes and purposes. And if you pry even further, you begin to suspect that the chair is not as you ordinarily imagine it. It arises because of many conditions, it is sustained by many interdependent factors, and it dissolves back into the stream of conditions when those factors change. This is the doorway into a core conversation of Buddha-era philosophy. Emptiness, no self, and the two truths. This segment of our exploration moves with care and precision, not to dismantle everyday life but to reframe it so that action, responsibility, and wonder can cohabit in a more spacious understanding. We will trace origins, map the landscape with care, and listen to the voices of thinkers who built these ideas into a rigorous system. We will hold in view two horizons at once: the conventional world of ordinary experience in which chairs and selves appear to have their own stubborn existence, and the ultimate horizon of emptiness, where things are seen as dependently originated, lacking intrinsic essence, and thus free to be seen in a more capacious light. If you stay with that tension, you can see how the Two Truths doctrine makes both levels of reality intelligible and usable in life. We begin with the roots and the architects. The seed of this inquiry is ancient and fissured by debate. The earliest Buddhist thinkers did not insist that nothing exists. Rather, they questioned whether things have an unchanging, independent essence that stands outside all relations. The key to this conversation is twofold. First, dependent origination, a doctrine that everything arises because of a network of causes and conditions. Second, emptiness, the mark that even that arising lacks an intrinsic, self-contained essence. The phrase that often anchors these ideas is pratityasamutpada, the notion that things come to be through mutual dependence. If you look closely at a moment's experience, a thought, a color, a frequency of sound, you see that it is not a single, self-generated spark but a constellation of conditions. Sensory inputs, prior mental states, cultural framing, linguistic conventions, memory, attention, and intention. When you ask, where does this thing come from, you must begin to count causes and conditions, not secrets of a hidden atomic essence. From this vantage, a philosopher named Nagarjuna rises as a towering figure. We can imagine him stepping into a bustling Nalanda courtyard, a scholar moving with a calm rhythm through thronged debates and quiet study rooms. Nagarjuna did not propose a single new object or a new metaphysical substance. He offered a method for interrogating every claim to intrinsic existence. In the Mula Madhyamakakarika, which scholars often translate as the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, he articulates what would become the core of the Madhyamaka view. All dharmas are without svabhava, without inherent existence. In Sanskrit, svabhava means own nature, essence. The word sunyata, emptiness, becomes not a void but a precise description of how things appear when you remove the assumption that they carry an independent, fixed core. A widely cited formulation draws the heart of this insight into a line that has become almost proverb: all things are empty of inherent existence. When Nagarjuna says this, he is not negating the ordinary everyday world. He is challenging the idea that the everyday world has a static, self-contained essence that makes it what it is, once and for all. Nagarjuna's method, which would become one of the most influential in Indian philosophy, is often described as the two truths framework, though the actual development of the two truths would take shape in the hands of his successors. The two truths are not two rival lands, but two ways of seeing. There is the conventional truth, the level at which we navigate life, language, and social practice. There is the ultimate truth, the level at which we see things as empty of independent existence and thus free from fixed essences. The two truths coexist, each indispensable for particular kinds of inquiry and action. To hold both is to navigate the world with ethical clarity and interpretive depth. Let us move from Nagarjuna to the second pillar of this early unfolding, Vasubandhu, a thinker who wrote with equal intensity about the mind and the path to liberation. Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakosabhasya, a comprehensive commentary on the early Abhidharma, is not a casual manual. It is a meticulous excavation of the nature of mind, perception, and the categories we use to make sense of experience. He works at the level of psychology and logic, insisting that our most basic taxonomies, sense bases, mental factors, episodes of cognition, must be scrutinized for their dependence on causes and conditions rather than assumed to be vibrantly inherent. In Vasubandhu's framework, the reliability of perception arises from the causal architecture that sustains it, but none of those causes or mental events carries a self subsisting apart from their conditions. This is a practical tension. The mind can function, classify, and act, but it should not pretend that its own objects or its own agency possess an eternal, unchanging core. Across the high table of Nalanda debates in the quieter corners of library rooms, we encounter a chorus of voices that expands these themes into a more systematic, rigorous method. The most famous of these expansions come in later centuries, under the leadership of Madhyamaka thinkers who sculpted the arguments into a distinct epistemic pragmatic program. Among them, Chandrakirti emerges as a crucial figure, an exegete whose commentaries crystallize the Prasangika approach to emptiness. Chandrakirti's sharpness is not cold logic for its own sake. It is a method intended to prevent misreadings that would turn emptiness into nihilism or into mere verbal gymnastics. In his Prasanapada, he insists that emptiness must be understood as the absence of intrinsic existence, not as a new kind of thing or a hidden essence. If one treats emptiness as a kind of thing, one misses the point. Emptiness, he argues, reveals the dependent character of all phenomena and at the same time preserves the space for ethics, agency, and real-world engagement. From these bones of theory, the bone of practice grows strongest under Tibetan as well as Chinese skies. In Tibet, Tsongkhapa becomes a central figure, a reformer who binds the Madhyamaka insight to a comprehensive system of ethics, epistemology, and ritual life. Tsongkhapa's approach, strongly grounded in the Madhyamaka core, but attentive to the demands of practice and pedagogy, helps illuminate how one might live within the two truths without collapsing either into mere theory. In China, the reception of emptiness travels along a different path, mediated by translators, scholars, and monks who face distinct cultural and philosophical climates. Kumarajava, whose translations from Sanskrit into Chinese helped to shape a broad reception in East Asia, emphasizes the coherence of emptiness with a moral and social life. Xuanzang, the great pilgrim and translator, not only carried texts eastward, but also wrestled with how to translate Buddhist concepts into a Chinese philosophical idiom that could speak to Taoist and Confucian sensibilities as well as to a Buddhist audience. He and later Chinese expositors would often present the emptiness of phenomena as a way to articulate a disciplined, ethical view of mind and society, one that could harmonize with existing intellectual traditions and the needs of governance, education, and personal cultivation. In our own listening, we can hear in these voices a pipeline, from Nagarjuna's early insistence on the emptiness of inherent nature, through Vasubandhu's analytic psychology, to Chandrakirti's rigorous Prasangika method, and then to the Tibetan and Chinese elaborations that translate and adapt these insights into living spiritual and ethical languages. The heart of the matter remains a diagnostic of how we imagine things to be and a cure for the misperceptions that generate suffering. Emptiness is not non-existence. It is possible recognition that existence is not a monolith of fixed essences. The self is not so much a thing as a story we tell ourselves about a persistent center of experience, and even that center, when pressed to its ultimate face, dissolves into a processual, dependent co-arising. To move from theory to living practice, we turn to the question of no-self, or anatta. This doctrine is often misunderstood as a negation of personal identity in some absolute sense. In Buddhist thought, the no-self thrust is not a denial of lived experience or of the continuity you feel in your own life. It is a challenge to the illusion of a fixed, independent core that would survive unaltered through time. Anata invites us to see that what we take to be the self is a continuum of processes, sensory impressions, memories, skillful and unskillful habits, dispositions, and contextual interpretations. If we insist on a self that must remain exactly as it is, we are binding ourselves to a form of reification that creates space for ego-driven clinging, fear, and alienation. If we instead see the self as a moving nexus, a stream of changing states that arises and passes away in relation to conditions, we may begin to approach life with more flexibility, compassion, and ethical sensitivity. This shift can be grasped through simple, accessible examples. Consider the self as a story we tell. We all carry narratives about our identity. I am a musician, I am a parent, I am not good at math. These labels structure how we act and how others treat us. Yet these are not unchanging essences. They are interpretations, often useful, sometimes constraining, that arise because of particular causes and conditions. Our experiences, training, feedback, social feedback, and even the language we use to describe ourselves. If we examine the story of the self in light of dependent origination, we begin to see how the narrative comes together and how it can be revised. The self is not an inner thing to be defended or possessed. It is a tacit arrangement of processes that can adapt with awareness and care. This does not make us evasive or amoral. On the contrary, it opens space for responsibility to be real because it arises within a system of interdependence and effect. Similarly, take the chair you are sitting on. If you ask for the chair's essence, you might imagine a single material substance that endows it with permanence across time. But a more accurate picture, one aligned with emptiness and dependent origination, says that the chair is the product of a chain of conditions. The wood came from trees that grew with sunlight and rain. The timber was milled, shaped, and joined by human hands. The chair exists as a usable object in a social world with conventions and purposes. The chair's right to exist is granted by a network of dependencies, a convention that chairs are for sitting, a marketplace that supplies materials, a language that allows you to refer to it as the chair, a set of expectations about where to place it in a room. If any one of those conditions changes, if the plan to replace wood with metal, or if your culture changes its concept of furniture, the chair changes or dissolves in meaning. The chair is not a static substance. It is a function within a living ecosystem of causes and meanings. When you anchor your perception of the chair in dependent origination rather than in an imagined essence, you discover the space to care for it and to repurpose it, understanding that its being is always in flux and always relational. The practice of understanding emptiness and the two truths has a long historical arc that bears the stamp of several generations of scholars who further sharpen these insights for different audiences. In particular, the two truths doctrine became a living tool for navigators of a wide range of social and ethical terrains. On the one hand, conventional truth grounds ethical action. A society must share language, rules, and expectations to coordinate efforts. It must teach children, treat illness, arrange markets, and maintain safety. These are conventional truths that permit people to cooperate, form families, build communities, and respond to suffering. On the other hand, ultimate truth, the emptiness of inherent existence, does not deny the reality of the moral world, it reframes it. If we see that beings and things do not possess fixed, independent essences, we begin to recognize that harm often arises from mistaken reifications, the belief that a person's identity or another object's nature is unchangeable. This insight can guide compassionate action. We act with the understanding that change is possible, that perceptions can be revised, and that our choices can influence a process that has no fixed start or finish. Two broad streams of interpretive development emerged from this core, the Tibetan and the Chinese. In Tibet, the later masters expanded the Madhyamaka framework into a dense, systematic philosophy that integrates logic, epistemology, ethics, and tantric practice. Chandrakirti's Prasa letter 1E45 GIK Madhyamaka, with its emphasis on reductio arguments and the centrality of dependent arising, became a powerful instrument for shaping a spiritual path that was also a rigorous intellectual discipline. Tsongkhapa, building on Chandrakirti, framed a comprehensive approach that situates emptiness within a broader ethical and pedagogical program. The Tibetan synthesis offered a robust method for dealing with philosophical objections, a practical orientation toward meditation, and an institutional culture that could train generations of monks, scholars, and lay practitioners. In China, the reception blended with the long-standing Taoist and Confucian currents. Kumarajava's translations helped bring Nagarjuna's ideas into Chinese philosophical discourse, presenting emptiness in a way that resonated with a culture attentive to harmony, order, and moral cultivation. Xuanzang's pilgrim narratives and translations further forged a bridge between Indian and East Asian intellectual worlds. The Chinese interpretive tradition often integrated emptiness with a pragmatic seriousness about governance, ethics, and social order. By presenting emptiness not as a metaphysical claim divorced from life, but as a lens through which to interpret the word in the world, these translators and commentators turned a technical Buddhist position into a living framework for thinking about mind, society, and personal conduct. The result is a spectrum of reception in which emptiness is not a single doctrine, but a family of interpretive strategies that adapt to cultural climates while preserving a core thematic. The insistence that existence is ultimately free from fixed, self-contained essences. To connect this to wider conversations outside Buddhism, we can place emptiness next to Advaita Vedanta, the Hindu tradition's rival metaphysical story about the nature of reality. Advaita, especially in the hands of Shankara, presents a monistic view in which the world of appearances is ultimately non-different from a single, unchanging reality, Brahman, yet it denies the world's ultimate reality as separate from that one reality. Buddhist emptiness, by contrast, refuses to posit a single ultimate substance that remains stable through time. Rather, it sees the dependently originated nature of phenomena as the condition for their emergence and cessation. The two views share a critical insight: appearances matter, but their apparent solidity and independence require careful scrutiny. They diverge in what they treat as ultimate and what counts as real in a way that can be used or misunderstood for ethical ends. The Advaitin may appeal to a non-dual ultimate to ground moral life in a single, unchanging foundation. The Madhyamaka philosopher reframes moral life as a matter of skillful means, operating within conventional truth to ease suffering, without clinging to any fixed essence as a basis for moral obligation. The dialogue between these views has stimulated centuries of reflection and has produced a deep cross-cultural conversation about what it means to be real, to know, and to act. A further cross-reference that enriches this meditation comes from the Stoics and from modern analytic discussions of identity and persistence. The Stoics asked how a person remains the same through time as events change, and they offered a theory of soul and habit that ties personal identity to rational continuity and moral character rather than to an unchanging inner substance. In contemporary analytic philosophy, thinkers have wrestled with the question of what it means for a person to persist across time when the body and psychology shift. Debates about constitutive personhood, the persistence of the self, and the nature of memory overlap in striking ways with Buddhist discussions of no self and dependent origination. The point is not to force a single conclusion, but to notice how different traditions converge on a shared issue: the problem of what it means for something to endure, and what it would mean for something to endure if it did not have a fixed essence. Meanwhile, cognitive science offers a different kind of mirror. Modern research into brain mechanisms for self-modeling, predictive coding, and the sense of agency presents a strikingly parallel picture to ancient meditation about the self. The brain constructs a model of the body and its place in the world, a model that is useful but not an everlasting essence. The sense of I arises from patterns of neural activity, attention, and interpretation. It can be reframed, revised, and refined as new data arrives. This echo from empirical science does not replace the philosophical argument about emptiness, but it lends it a modern texture. If the self is a robust model, not a thing with a fixed essence, then the practice of ethics, responsibility, and compassion remains intact and perhaps even more credible. We are agents shaped by causal networks, capable of changing those networks through intentional action, learning, and habit formation. Let us anchor these high-level threads with concrete counterarguments and careful responses. The first counterargument is a familiar worry. If emptiness means there is no inherent existence, then aren't we sliding toward nihilism? If everything is merely interdependent and lacking an intrinsic nature, why bother with values, duties, or meaning? A natural corollary for some readers is a fear that emptiness could release us from moral constraints, leaving us with moral disengagement or cynicism. The Buddhist reply to this fear is subtle but powerful. Emptiness does not deprive ethical life of its reasons. It frees ethical life from clinging to rigid essences and from weaponizing fixed identities as justification for harm. The two truths doctrine is central here. Conventional truth gives us a robust field for ethics, care, reciprocity, social responsibility, compassion, while ultimate truth refrains from reifying beings or things as possessing independent reality. The moral horizon is not transcended by emptiness, it is clarified by it. In practical terms, the absence of intrinsic self and of fixed essences means that our actions can change outcomes in a way that respects interdependence. Karma, causal sequences of ethical intention and action, remains the durable fabric of ethical life. If you burn a bridge because you think the other is simply a fixed obstacle, you damage real relationships. If you act with the understanding that both you and others are contingent and interdependent, you're more likely to act with care, with responsibility, and with the willingness to repair what is broken. The second counterargument is the worry that no self can undermine identity and responsibility at a visceral level. If there is no fixed self to own a mistake or to own a virtue, what is left of accountability? The Buddhist answer is that no self does not erase responsibility. It reframes it as responsibility to processes and to the conditions that allow a person to act with awareness and intention. The continuity of a person's life is not a matter of a fixed core, but of the coherence and reliability of the causal story we continually tell about ourselves. If we see the self as an unfolding process, we can still own our actions and their consequences, their effects in others, their effect on our own mental states and our capacity to grow. In fact, the no-self insight can strengthen responsibility by removing the illusion that one's actions stem from an unchangeable essence. It encourages humility. I am partly product of my family, my culture, my brain, my education, my luck, my previous choices. It also invites agency. By understanding that many aspects of the self are contingent, one can cultivate new habits, transform attitudes, and repair harm. The moral life does not degenerate into moral relativism. Rather, it becomes more responsive, more adaptable, and more open to the possibility of genuine change. A further layer of nuance arises in the practical function of the two truths. The conventional world that we inhabit, our social rituals, our legal systems, our ethics, our personal relationships, must have a stable interpretive framework for life to go on. Without some level of conventional reality, a mother cannot feed a baby, a teacher cannot answer a student, a lawyer cannot adjudicate a case. The ultimate reality is not a denial of those facts, but their deeper reading. Things do not exist with the independence or solidity they seem to have. When this is understood, conventional life remains vibrant and meaningful, but free from the trap of reifying its contents. If we confuse conventional entities with independent essences, we will inevitably suffer. If we treat conventional entities as contingent and interdependent, we have the means to soften hurt, to adjust plans when conditions change, and to approach life with a flexible ethics anchored by intention. The ethical center, karma and intention, binds the two truths in a way that makes sense of moral life. If we act with awareness of interdependence, our intentions matter deeply, and the consequences of actions ripple in ways we can influence. Now, to ground the discussion in historical episodes that illuminate how these ideas traveled and were transformed, let us consider two vivid anecdotes. The Nalanda tradition of Buddhist logic and debate provides one. Nalanda was a great seat of learning that hosted debates on the nature of reality, perception, and the mind. The logic tradition there, building on Dignaga and later Dharmakirti, created sophisticated pramana theory, the study of the means by which we know things, and established careful methods for testing and refining arguments. In debates about emptiness, scholars would challenge each other to demonstrate that a given phenomenon possesses or lacks inherent existence. The practice was not a sterile exercise in cleverness. It was a means to purify understanding and deepen ethical intention. The debates could become intense as the participants pressed each other on the boundaries of conventional truth and ultimate truth, forcing responses that sharpened both sides. The Nalanda context shows how philosophical inquiry in Buddhism is embedded in a social world of learning, debate, and shared aspiration toward liberation. It also shows that emptiness is not a retreat from the world, but a rigorous way to examine how the world is made to seem. The second anecdote concerns the Chinese and Tibetan receptions of emptiness and how those receptions reframed the conversation for different audiences. In China, the transmission of Nagarjuna and his followers arrived within a culture that valued harmony, social order, and ethical cultivation. The Chinese translator Kumarajava helped recast emptiness in a way that resonated with a broad audience that included Taoist and Confucian readers. The emphasis often highlighted the moral and social implications of emptiness, the idea that things are not fixed, and thus that one's relationships and duties are mutable and improvable. In Tibet, the reception took shape within a monastic and scholastic environment that prized rigorous argument and systematic integration of philosophy with practice and ritual. Chandrakirti's Prasangika method became a tool for training minds toward clarity and compassion, and Tsongkhapa's synthesis offered a comprehensive program, philosophical analysis, meditation, ethics, and monastic discipline that made emptiness a precise instrument for transformation. The Tibetan reframing often foregrounded the idea that emptiness shields concepts from being absolutized. It allows an ethical life to be enacted with humility and skillful means, even as the ultimate nature of phenomena remains beyond the grasp of ordinary cognition. The Chinese reframing, in contrast, was less about a doctrinal system than about creating a hospitable space for emptiness to be taught and lived in ways that interacted with existing traditions and social needs. Both trajectories show that the profound insights of emptiness and the two truths could be adapted without losing their core clarities, and that such adaptation can enrich ethical life in multiple climates. As we weave together these threads, let us place a pair of important cross-references in view. First, Advaita Vedanta offers a beneficial counterpoint, a competing metaphysical view within Hindu thought that emphasizes non-duality. Advaita's emphasis on Brahman as the sole ultimate reality and on the illusory status of the phenomenal world is a different response to the problem of how things are. Buddhism answers with a different diagnostic. There is no unchanging, independent essence to things to begin with, and the mind's own misperceptions create suffering. Second, the Stoic and contemporary analytic discussions of identity and persistence make for an illuminating dialogue. The Stoics ask how a person remains the same through time in the face of changing experiences. Contemporary analytic thinkers examine whether personal identity requires a fixed center. These debates converge with Buddhist questions about no-self and continuity. They all probe what it would mean for something to stay the same when it is, in crucial ways, shaped by conditions, memory, habit, and interpretation. A final bridge is to cognitive science, where researchers describe self-models, the brain's constructed representations of the self, and show that these models are robust but fallible. Taken together, these cross-references show that the questions Buddha-era philosophers asked about emptiness and no-self resonate far beyond their own lineage. They participate in a long conversation about what counts as real, what gives life its value, and how we should live in the face of a world we never fully possess. To connect with real-world practice, we can ground the two truths and emptiness in two practical exercises. The first is a reflective inquiry into the self as a story. Each time you hear yourself saying, "I am such and such," pause and ask, what would this sentence look like if I removed the assumption of a fixed, independent core? What if the I is a pattern of attitudes, habits, and experiences that can be changed? Notice how this simple question does not abolish your sense of self. It loosens the grip of a fixed self and invites you to experiment with new possibilities. The second exercise concerns the chair. This time, notice how your attention moves when you consider it as an interdependent nexus. When the chair is understood as a function of a larger web of conditions, materials, design, use, social convention, and the moment of sitting, your relationship to it becomes more flexible. If you drop the belief in its essential chair-ness, you may realize you can adjust, repurpose, or even let go of attachment to the chair in moments of need. In both exercises, you begin to live the two truths as a form of mindful wisdom. You act in the world with clarity about conventional reality, while you hold a deeper understanding of emptiness that frees you from fixed reifications and from grasping at permanence. We should also listen to some primary voices that anchor these reflections. Nagarjuna, in the Mulamadhyamakakarika, is often summarized as saying that all dharmas are empty of inherent existence. The Heart Sutra, a text that demonstrates the intimacy of form and emptiness, offers the compact phrase, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." The Chinese translator Kumaragava presents a version of these points that speaks to social and ethical coherence, while Xuanzang's translations carry the same core ideas into a climate where they could engage with local philosophical concerns. The Tibetan elaborations, Chandrakirti emphasizing the Prasangika method and Tsongkhapa refining it into a wide-ranging program, provide the kind of rigorous apparatus that enables a practitioner to work through philosophical obstacles in meditation and in daily life. The old Nalanda debates remind us that philosophy in this tradition often lives in conversation, logic, critique, and a shared commitment to awakening. The Tibetan and Chinese receptions suggest that the same questions can be asked in different idioms and for different purposes, yet still be answered in ways that keep the core insight intact. That appearances are not the same as essences, that we are not bound to fixed identities, and that freedom from fixation can become the ground for both wisdom and compassionate action. In closing, it may be helpful to recall a few sentences that people often associate with these traditions, not as fixed dogma, but as possible guides for reflection. Nagarjuna's claim about emptiness invites you to see the world as threaded with interdependence, not as a set of isolated objects with independent cores. The Heart Sutra's taught line, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, opens a doorway into perceiving how phenomena co-arise and co-cease, not by accident but by design, with causes present and conditions changing. The two truths remind us that there is a manner in which life can be lived that is both practical and deeper than mere appearances. It is possible to act in the world with a clear sense of intention and responsibility, to engage in relationships, and to cultivate a mind that does not cling to fixed identities or fixed outcomes. The no-self insight does not erase the experience of being a person among others. It invites a compassionate, flexible, and ethically oriented stance that attends to the needs of others and to the changes that time necessarily brings. If you carry this segment with you into your day, you might notice how your perception of your own self changes with a deeper sense of interdependence. You may find yourself asking more carefully, what is this problem I'm facing? Is it a fixed obstacle that will last forever, or is it a temporary configuration of causes and conditions that will evolve? When you encounter a difficult person or a painful memory, you can return to the idea of no self and dependent origination to widen the space in which you respond. You can practice with a sense of restraint, allowing thoughts to pass without clinging to them as absolute truth, and with a sense of openness, acknowledging that new circumstances can alter outcomes in a way that remains ethically meaningful. The aim is not to dethrone reality, but to resituate it so that you are less trapped by fixed illusions and more capable of acting with clarity, kindness, and wise discernment. As we move forward in our exploration of Buddha-era metaphysics and epistemology, we will continue to return to this central triangle: emptiness, no self, and the two truths. We will listen to Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, Chandrakirti, Tsongkhapa, Kumarajava, Xuanzang, and the Tibetan and Chinese interpreters who carried these ideas across centuries and continents. We will look at how these ideas interact with modern debates in philosophy, in cognitive science, and in everyday life. We will examine the ways in which people have used emptiness to challenge rigid dogmas, to loosen the grip of ego, to cultivate ethical intention, and to practice with compassion. We will consider the criticisms and the defenses, the fears and the hopes that accompany any attempt to reframe what it means to be a person, to know, and to live well. For now, carry with you a simple invitation: to observe not only the world as it appears, but the way it appears. To notice that the chair on which you rest has a history and a network of relationships that sustain it. To notice that your own sense of self is a moving mosaic rather than a fixed fortress. To test these impressions against the two truths, recognizing the practical necessity of conventional life while holding lightly to the ultimate insight that nothing stands apart from the web of causes and conditions. If you can walk with that balance in mind, you walk with a form of freedom that makes space for both wisdom and kindness to flourish. In the chapters ahead, we will walk with more patience through the arguments of Nagarjuna and his successors. We will engage the debates that shaped the Nalanda logic tradition. We will hear how the Chinese and Tibetan communities reinterpreted emptiness for different audiences, and we will consider how these insights can continue to illuminate questions about identity, justice, and science today. There will be moments that seem abstract and others that feel almost practical to a fault, precisely the space where theory and life touch. And in that contact, there is a quiet, steady invitation. Allow your understanding to rest gently, to loosen without breaking, to see without grasping, and to act with a patience and responsibility that comes from seeing things as they are while still living them with care. If you return to these themes again and again, you will notice a certain rhythm in the argument, the insistence that nothing has an intrinsic essence, the patient demonstration of how things arise together, the compassionate aim that such seeing ought to cultivate. The two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth, are not a contradiction but a double lens. They enable you to move with clarity in the world and with freedom in inward life. They invite you to hold on to ethical intention while understanding that your most fundamental concepts, self, object, circumstance, are never as solid as they sometimes appear. And most of all, they invite you to cultivate the discernment and courage to act wisely, to engage with others with openness, and to let habits slowly yield to understanding, so that both you and the world you inhabit can change for the better together. If you are listening to this, you are part of that long, patient conversation. The voices you hear in your ears are not just voices from a distant past. They are living interlocutors in your present moment, offering you a way to look at things that can reform how you think, speak, and behave. The tradition asks you to examine your own experience, to reassess where you think solidity exists, and to consider what it would mean to live with that awareness. It asks you to hold two truths at once: that the world is full of reliable conventions that enable cooperation and care, and that above and beyond those conventions, things do not possess independent, unchanging essence. The result is not cynicism, but a more capacious form of engagement, a life that is both grounded and unbound, both careful and free to change, both real in its consequences and luminous in its possibility. And so, with patience, we will keep returning to the core questions. What is emptiness? What is no self? How do the two truths function in practice? Who were the figures who named and sharpened these questions, and how did their readers and critics, the Nalanda logicians, the Tibetan scholars, the Chinese translators, refashion them for their own worlds? What are the concrete implications for everyday perception, language, ethics, and responsibility? And how might modern readers, psychologists, philosophers of mind, cognitive scientists, students, teachers, and meditators find in these ancient lines a set of tools for healing the rifts that separation and ignorance have long produced? The path is long and the questions profound, but the invitation is simple. Slow down, look closely, and listen for the ways in which emptiness and interdependence can transform how we think, how we love, and how we live. Ethics, society, and liberation unfolds as a map that begins in the heart and then expands outward into families, communities, and the institutions that shape the everyday world. In Buddhist thought, there is no sharp split between personal virtue and public virtue, no division between the ethics of a single life and the ethics of a city, a nation, or a planet. The path begins with intention, discipline, and compassion, and it ripples outward through acts of generosity, restraint, and care that seek to transform not only the self, but the structures that govern life together. To explore this is to walk through a living architecture of practice. The 5 precepts for lay followers, the Vinaya for monastics, and a core ethical imagination grounded in the 4 Brahmaviharas: compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. It is to ask how karma and rebirth function not as mere metaphysical doctrine, but as practical explanations for the ethical, whether we experience, and the personal, whether we cultivate. And it is to see how such ideas become visible in social action, in generosity, in responsibility toward others, and in the awakening of communities that sustain one another through care, education, and service. Let us start with the basic ethical framework that has organized Buddhist life for 2.5 millennia. For lay followers, the 5 precepts offer a workable, demanding, and transformative threshold. They are not merely prohibitions, but invitations to cultivate a field of ethical attention, to abstain from taking life, from taking that which is not given, from sexual violation or exploitation, from false speech, and from intoxicants that cloud discernment. These are not static duties but living commitments that require ongoing mindfulness. They are reinforced within a broader social logic, a life in which the good of others is not an afterthought but the intention that shapes speech, actions, and the rhythms of everyday choice. When a lay practitioner keeps the precepts, the world becomes less dangerous for others, and the practice of generosity becomes more credible because restraint is visible, not only proclaimed. For monastics, the Vinaya provides a more stringent and intricate set of rules designed to cultivate a robust ethical ecology within the Sangha, the community of those committed to renunciation and the awakened life. The Vinaya is not a punitive code so much as a system of governance that protects the integrity, harmony, and safety of the path. It regulates ordination procedures, daily routines, rules about communal living, and guidance on handling conflict, discipline, and ethical failure. It is a practical technology of ethics that acknowledges that intense practice can amplify both insight and vulnerability, and it seeks to create a space in which the Dharma can be studied, transmitted, and embodied with trust and accountability. In both lay and monastic domains, ethics is a practice of attention to impact, to intention, and to the ways in which even seemingly small acts accumulate into patterns of character and social climate. At the heart of Buddhist ethical life are the 4 Brahmaviharas: karuna, metta, mudita, and upekkha. These are not merely internal states but dispositions that frame how one treats others and how communities relate to difference and distress. Karuna, or compassion, asks us to respond with sensitivity to the suffering of others and to act in ways that alleviate that suffering. Metta, loving kindness, invites a benevolent regard that extends beyond kinship and reciprocity to all beings, including those who may seem distant or even adversarial. Mudita, sympathetic joy, calls us to rejoice in the good of others, not out of envy, but out of a confident recognition that another's flourishing does not diminish our own, and that shared happiness multiplies the conditions for greater harmony. Upekkha, equanimity, anchors ethical action in a spacious steadiness that can hold both joy and sorrow, praise and blame, with a mind that does not collapse into reactivity or judgment. Together, these 4 favors create an ethical climate that supports honest speech, responsible action, and the courage to speak truth with kindness when it is most difficult to do so. Karma and rebirth provide a frame for making sense of ethical cause and effect, and for naming the long arc of personal development and social consequence. In Buddhist thought, karma is not a simple ledger of reward and punishment, but a generative matrix, an explanation of how intentional actions seed states of mind, shape patterns of perception, and contribute to recurring patterns of experience across lifetimes. Rebirth, in this view, offers a pragmatic account of ethical continuity. A life shaped by greed, hatred, and delusion tends to yield a stream of unwholesome experiences, whereas a life cultivated by generosity, ethical discipline, and wisdom tends toward more luminous and less afflicted patterns of experience. Yet this is not a crude mechanism of fate. It is rather a pedagogical tool that invites ongoing self-scrutiny and reform. It helps practitioners attend to the consequences of their choices in the present and to take responsibility for how those choices reverberate into the future, both personally and socially. In practical terms, karma and rebirth translate into social action by pointing us toward the consequences of everyday conduct for others. This is where dana, or generosity, becomes central. Dana is not simply giving a donation or performing a charitable act. It is a relational practice that recognizes interdependence and our shared vulnerability. It can be as simple as offering a listening ear, as generous as providing time and resources to those who lack access to safety and education, and as monumental as participating in programs that remove structural barriers to well-being. In Buddhist ethics, generosity is intertwined with wisdom. Giving becomes meaningful when it arises from a clear understanding of impermanence, of non-attachment to outcomes, and of an intention to reduce suffering without cultivating a sense of superiority or control. It is a practice that invites accountability, transparency, and humility, qualities that enable communities to grow more resilient, more inclusive, and more capable of sustaining even the most difficult conversations. The healing and transforming potential of Buddhist ethics come alive most vividly when we turn from abstract principle to concrete social life. The Sangha historically has been more than a spiritual club. It has been a trial ground and a workshop for moral formation. In many Buddhist cultures, the Sangha has functioned as a learning community that educates lay supporters, supports the development of monasteries as centers of learning, and cares for the vulnerable. The sick, the elderly, the orphans, and the marginalized. This interplay between monastic and lay life creates a dynamic ecology in which education is not merely a matter of doctrinal instruction, but of social pedagogy. The monastic institutions often serve as repositories of scriptural interpretation, ritual practice, and ethical casuistry. The lay communities carry forward the energy of engagement into family life, business, and politics. The Sangha's historical organization of communities is a reminder that ethical transformation is not accomplished by individual effort alone. It requires institutions that value the education of citizens, the maintenance of welfare programs, and the care that accompanies aging and illness. Two historical stories illuminate how Buddhist ethics has traveled beyond the temple door and into governance and cross-cultural encounter. The first is the reform program of Ashoka the Great, a milestone in the history of Buddhist ethics translated into political practice. After his conversion, Ashoka oriented his rule around a moral ideal that he called Dhamma, a polity of moral governance designed to reduce violence, expand welfare, and promote social harmony. He thrust the Dharma into the political arena in a manner that was unusual for ancient empires. Public welfare projects, roads, wells, rest houses, veterinary care for animals, and charitable hospitals accompanied policies that favored religious tolerance and freedom of inquiry. Ashoka did not abandon military power. He reframed it in terms of restraint and responsibility, insisting that governance should be guided by the welfare of all beings and by respect for life. In his edicts, we hear a voice that sought to replace fear with trust, coercion with consent, and cruelty with care. The moral governance of Ashoka becomes a vivid historical instance of the way ethical ideals can translate into institutional design. The language of his edicts frequently cites nonviolence, welfare, compassion, truth, and benevolence toward all creatures. One of the most striking features is not merely the injunctions to refrain from harm, but the broader program of public works and welfare, an attempt to realize ethically the interdependence that Buddhist ethics names as central. The sign that this program had legs was not only in the scriptures but in the built environment. Wells carved into rock for thirsty travelers, planting of trees along streets to offer shade, funds for immunities against disease, and a language that legitimized care as political virtue. The second historical story is the Milinda Panha, an ancient dialogue that cast Buddhist ethics into a cross-cultural encounter with the Hellenistic world of the Greek kingdoms in northwest India. The dialogue between the Buddhist sage Nagasena and King Menander, Milinda in Pali, is a remarkable laboratory for examining how a non-theistic, empirical psychology could meet a cosmopolitan audience with questions about self, virtue, doubt, and the basis for ethical life. The Melinda Panha uses a series of questions and paradoxes to test how Buddhist ethics stands up to argument, persuasion, and the challenge of other cultural horizons. It is a text that invites readers to see that ethical reasoning is not a monologue but a dialogic enterprise. Nagasana's most famous teaching, the chariot analogy, offers a powerful way of resolving the perennial problem of the self from a practical, non-essentialist stance. A chariot, he argues, is not a thing by itself, but a designation arising from the combination of wheels, axle, frame, and other parts, dependent on conditions and causality. When Menander asks whether the person is the same before and after death, Nagasana answers with the insistence that identity is a conventional designation arising from dependence on conditions. The chariot metaphor becomes more than a clever riddle. It is a rigorous way of reframing ethical responsibility. If the person is not a fixed, independent essence, then the ethical relation to others must be understood as a dynamic interplay of causes, conditions, and commitments that persist across changing forms. The Melinda Panha thus invites a cross-cultural reader to witness how ethical life can be defended and developed through reasoned dialogue, while also recognizing the limits and possibilities of different interpretive communities. The Greek audience is not merely a foil for Buddhist ideas. The dialogue is a stage on which the universality and particularity of ethical thinking can be tested, negotiated, and enlarged. From these two examples, Ashoka's reform program and the Melinda Panha's dialogic test, we can draw important cross-cutting lessons about Buddhist ethics in public life. First, Buddhism does not separate the moral from the political in a naive sense. It asks what governance should look like when it is animated by compassion, restraint, and a respect for life. This is not a naive pacifism that ignores the world's dangers, but a robust insistence that policies should minimize harm, maximize welfare, and cultivate conditions under which people can live with dignity. Second, Buddhist ethics thrives in a climate of ongoing dialogue. The Melinda Panha shows how a tradition can be examined, challenged, and refined through conversation with other cultures. The result is not relativism, but a more mature confidence in the capacity of a living tradition to respond to new questions, while remaining anchored in its core commitments to nonviolence, wisdom, and compassion. These texts remind us that ethical life has always been a conversation across time and space, not a dogmatic doctrine that travels in a sealed box. Yet no account of Buddhist ethics would be honest without acknowledging significant critiques and counterarguments. One critique is that Buddhist ethics can appear detached from political action, especially in contexts where social and political upheaval demand immediate, forceful action. Critics argue that a stance of restraint or nonviolence can seem to excuse oppression or neglect urgent demands for justice when systems of power are generating clear harm. In response, Buddhist ethics has often been reinterpreted in terms of engaged practice. The call to transform social structures through compassionate action, the cultivation of courage in the face of injustice, and the insistence that wisdom and non-harm can accompany decisive, even disruptive, struggle when necessary. The question then is not whether ethical practice can be politically effective, but how it remains faithful to the ends of non-harm and the alleviation of suffering while engaging robustly with real-world power. A second counterargument concerns the sense in which Buddhist ethics could become morally relative across traditions. If the core is compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, what prevents one tradition from calling one practice virtuous while another calls a different practice virtuous, thereby eroding universal moral standards? The critique here is not that compassion is implausible, but that the scope and application of ethics can appear contingent on cultural and doctrinal frames. Proponents of Buddhist ethics respond by offering a cross-tradition analysis that respects particular histories and doctrines while pointing to shared human concerns. The dignity of life, the relief of suffering, the cultivation of wise discernment, and the protection of the vulnerable. The conversation with Confucian, Christian, Stoic, and modern human rights discourses helps illuminate both similarities and tensions. For instance, Confucian notions of benevolence and ritual propriety align with Buddhist emphasis on non-harm and social harmony. Though Confucian ethics often centers on social roles and hierarchical relationships in ways that Buddhists might reinterpret as interdependent co-arising rather than fixed duties of rank. Christian ethics, with its emphasis on agape, unconditional love, offers a ground for universal care that resonates with metta in Buddhist thought. Yet Christian ethics also foregrounds a transcendent moral law that can appear to differ from Buddhist non-dual, interdependent causation. Stoic virtue theory, with its insistence on the rational ordering of the passions and the cultivation of virtuous character in the face of fortune, likewise provides a resonant vocabulary for Buddhist ethics while maintaining a distinct metaphysical and soteriological horizon. The aim, then, is not to collapse these into a single system, but to see how shared aspirations for human flourishing can illuminate tensions, reveal blind spots, and help build a more inclusive, robust moral vocabulary that can address contemporary global problems like inequality, climate change, and human rights abuses. This brings us to a third set of questions. How do we interpret karma in the face of systemic injustice? If karma suggests that moral cause and effect play out across lifetimes, there is a risk that it becomes a justification for resignation, a doctrine swiftly deployed to explain persistent disadvantage as somehow deserved or inevitable. The ethical response in Buddhist communities to such concerns has often been twofold. First, it reorients karma toward agency in the present. Our choices, even under oppressive conditions, shape future streams of experience and influence the conditions under which others experience oppression or relief. This reframes moral responsibility not as compensation for past deeds, but as conscious cultivation of seeds that will mature into wiser, more compassionate action. Second, Buddhist ethics emphasizes interdependence and structural insight. If our suffering is entangled with others, so too is our healing. This is why the tradition has long valued collective practice, social solidarity, and public welfare as expressions of the bodhisattva ideal and of the Buddhist ethic of non-harm. In other words, karma is not invoked as a passive excuse for the status quo, but as a call to attentive action that can transform minds, communities, and institutions. The problem of systemic injustice then becomes a problem for collective and strategic action. How do we organize, demand, and implement change in ways that honor the dignity of every being while remaining committed to the transformation of the conditions that produce harm? Our exploration of ethics, society, and liberation would be incomplete without two historical anecdotes that illuminate a modern horizon of engaged practice. The first is the emergence of engaged Buddhism, a movement that carries forward the ancient ethical commitments into political and social action. Think, for example, of Thich Nhat Hanh, who, in the mid to late 20th century, reframed Buddhist practice as a form of sustained social engagement. He urged practitioners to bring mindfulness into the tumult of public life, to practice compassion in the arena of war and conflict, and to build communities, ordained and lay, that act with conscience and responsibility. The phrase he popularized, interbeing, the recognition that all beings are interconnected, captures a radical rethinking of individualism. The flourishing of one depends on the flourishing of many, and public life becomes a practice ground for awakening. The second anecdote concerns the ongoing efforts of Buddhist communities to address pressing worldly issues: racial justice, refugee care, climate ethics, and public health. The insistence that compassionate action translate into concrete forms of care, whether through education programs for marginalized youth, disaster relief, or sustainable economic practices, shows how the Dharma translates into ways of living that are accessible, practical, and recognizable within modern civic life. These anecdotes illustrate that Buddhism's ethical imagination does not vanish at the border of the temple. Rather, it moves into schools, hospitals, factories, and parliaments, offering a cultivated presence that can sustain and transform social life. To grapple with these practical horizons, it is helpful to cross-reference Buddhist ethics with other long-standing traditions of moral reflection. Confucian thought emphasizes benevolence, social harmony, and the cultivation of virtue through proper ritual and role relationships. The Buddhist account of interdependence and non-harm can be harmonized with Confucian aims by imagining a political order in which compassion guides leadership and ritual supports the flourishing of all members of the community. Yet the two traditions diverge in where they locate authority and in how they understand the self's relation to social roles. Christian ethical thought, especially in its emphasis on agape and the inherent worth of every person created in the image of the divine, resonates with Buddhist commitments to universal care and non-harm, while introducing a theological horizon that can reframe the purposes of moral life as oriented toward a transcendent good. Stoic virtue theory shares with Buddhism a focus on character and the regulation of passions, the capacity to bear misfortune with equanimity, and a disciplined rationality in moral life. The differences between Stoic and Buddhist accounts illuminate how different communities have tried to turn ethical insight into the shape of a lived reality. Meanwhile, modern human rights discourse, born out of Enlightenment ideals and shaped by global constitutionalism, provides a secular frame within which Buddhist ethics can be translated into universal claims about dignity, equality, and the protection of life. The tension here is not simply between Buddhist and Western frameworks. It is a conversation about how to articulate and realize the common good in pluralistic societies, how to reconcile local forms of practice with universal values, and how to ensure accountability to the most vulnerable. As we close this segment, I want to emphasize why this ethical vision matters as a living, constructive practice. First, Buddhist ethics insists that the good life is not a solitary achievement, but a practice of relational responsibility. The practice of metta becomes a daily discipline of addressing others with care, while karuna translates into concrete acts of relief for those who suffer, whether through personal acts of kindness or through institutional reforms that reduce harm. Second, the ethics of interdependence teaches us to see beyond the illusion of separate selves, and to recognize that the well-being we seek cannot be achieved by a solitary ascent, but only by building networks of care, institutions of education, and communities of mutual support. Dana, the practice of generosity, is a continual reminder that giving is not merely a temporary fix to need, but a way of recognizing and honoring the essential interrelation of all beings. Third, the resurgence of engaged practice in modern times shows that Buddhism can translate its core insights into political and social measures that contribute to the common good. The Ashokan ideal of moral governance and the cross-cultural testing ground of the Milinda Panha offer two different but complementary horizons. One that situates ethics inside a political project of welfare and restraint, and another that treats ethical reasoning as a shared enterprise across cultures, tested by dialogue and exposure to difference. Together, they show that Buddhist ethics has always harbored within it a desire to nurture life in all its variation, to reduce suffering wherever it is found, and to foster communities that can endure time, loss, and even injustice with discernment, courage, and patience. To glimpse how these ideas might imperfectly translate into concrete practice today, consider two vivid scenarios that illuminate the complexity and promise of Buddhist ethics. First, imagine a local city council facing a budget crisis that demands cuts in welfare services. A Buddhist activist in the community might propose a three-part approach. First, to attend to the suffering of those most affected by the cuts with direct, compassionate engagement. Second, to seek reforms that retain essential services while exploring sustainable, ethical reallocations of resources. Third, to mobilize education and public dialogue that builds collective buy-in for a long-term strategy built on mutual aid. The key is not merely to advocate for more welfare, but to root policy in the ethical habits of dana, metta, and upekkha. Care that is deliberate, reasoned, and shared. The second scenario involves a multinational corporation confronted with accusations of exploitation in supply chains. A Buddhist-informed leadership might respond by instituting audit processes that prioritize transparency, fair labor standards, and the elimination of coercive practices. By establishing internal training on mindfulness and ethical decision-making, and by engaging with workers, communities, and regulators in a spirit of karuna and shared responsibility. These responses would not be reductions of business decisions to moral sentiment. They would be reforms that recognize the moral weight of everyday managerial choices and the interdependence that makes corporate action morally consequential. In exploring this section's ambitions, it is also important to acknowledge that the depth and breadth of Buddhist ethics invite ongoing interpretation and adaptation. The basic precepts in the four Brahmaviharas provide a durable moral vocabulary, but their applications must be read in light of context, history, and plural modes of life. The cross-references to Confucian, Christian, Stoic, and modern human rights discourses serve not to flatten differences, but to illuminate how ethical insight travels and transforms across cultures. The questions that arise from this comparative reading are not simply about agreement or disagreement. They are about how to nurture a humane future in which the dignity and welfare of every being are valued and protected. The ethical life in this light is a living practice, a continuous, reflective, and courageous effort to act with wisdom and kindness in the face of uncertainty, to work with others toward greater harmony, and to bless the world with the generosity of a mind that is ready to see suffering and to respond with sincere action. As you continue this exploration of ethics, society, and liberation, remember that the path is not an abstract map, but a practice you carry into your daily life. The 5 precepts may guide personal conduct. The Vinaya may structure a monastic community. The 4 Brahmaviharas may shape your inner life and your outward interactions. Karma may explain why actions matter over time. Rebirth may offer a long horizon for personal development. Dana may anchor you in generosity, and Sangha may remind you that communities are a school of moral formation. The two historical anchors, Ashoka's governance that linked power with welfare, and the Milinda Panha's dialogic method that welcomed cross-cultural testing, show us that ethics can be both practical and principled, both rooted in a tradition and alive in conversation with others. The two counterarguments, ethical detachment from political action and potential relativism across traditions, challenge us to craft a more robust, responsive ethics that can meet the demands of a complex world. The two anecdotes, engaged Buddhism with Thich Nhat Hanh and modern social efforts, point to a living horizon where ancient wisdom meets contemporary necessity. And the cross-references with Confucian, Christian, Stoic, and human rights discourses invite a richer dialogue about what it means to live well together across diverse communities. If you take one message away from this exploration, let it be this: Buddhist ethics is not a retreat from the world but a discipline of response. It is an invitation to awaken a mind that can bear witness to suffering without becoming desensitized, to act with skillful means in the service of healing, and to participate in social life in ways that make the world more just, more compassionate, and more alive to the dignity of every being. The living practice of ethics is, in this sense, a form of liberation not merely for the individual but for the surrounding world, a liberation that unfolds through daily choices, through leadership that seeks the welfare of all, and through communities that sustain with care the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the hopeful alike. This is the ethos of ethics, society, and liberation, a map that begins with a simple intention: do no harm, cultivate kindness, and act wisely, and becomes, through patient practice, a living architecture of a world that can be different because we choose to be different every day. We can also recognize that the work is never finished, that the dialogue with other traditions and with contemporary life continues to refine and test our understanding. The more we listen to suffering, to dissent, to the voices of the young, to the marginalized, to the global South and North, the more the Dharma shows its capacity to enrich our shared life. The call to practice becomes a call to transformation that honors both the particularity of communities and the universality of compassion. It invites a compassionate courage. The courage to propose reforms that protect life, to stand with the vulnerable when it costs us something, to ask hard questions within our own institutions, and to design institutions that embody care as a public virtue rather than a private virtue. In this sense, the ethics of Buddhism is a political and spiritual project in the old sense of the word, a project aimed at the flourishing of life, the alleviation of suffering, and the realization that the deepest freedom comes not from domination but from dependence well understood, nurtured, and practiced with wisdom, humility, and love. When we talk about Buddha's philosophy in the modern world, we are not simply recounting a set of ideas. We are tracing a living practice, a discipline that began as a path of liberation and has in our time become a set of techniques, institutions, and cultural forms that people adopt in hospitals, schools, workplaces, and living rooms. Mindfulness, meditation, and their reception across continents ask us to hold two truths at once: that the Buddhist path is a transformative practice with ethical and spiritual aims, and that its contemporary forms are often secularized, adapted, and repurposed to fit very different social needs. The section you're about to hear intends to remain faithful to that tension, to illuminate the ancient roots and the modern branches, to present the core methods with their lived consequences, and to engage with the questions, doubts, and criticisms that naturally arise when a centuries-old spiritual discipline meets pop psychology, busy modern life, and empirical science. Origin and core aim: practice as the vehicle of transformation. The Buddha did not present a philosophy in the abstract that you could admire in arguments alone. He offered a path, an invitation to investigate the way minds cling, spin, and suffer, and to learn a radically practical way to loosen that grip. The core turning of the teaching is captured in the Four Noble Truths: that life in its ordinary mode involves suffering or dissatisfaction, that this suffering has an identifiable cause, craving, clinging, the habitual reactivity of mind, that there is a cessation of suffering, a possibility of release, and that there is a path, the noble Eightfold Path, that leads out of suffering, a path that trains the mind and cultivates ethics and wisdom. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha lays out the Four Noble Truths with a clarity that remains strikingly contemporary. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. To be bound to what is unpleasant is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. The point is not to doom us with a bleak metaphysical claim, but to offer a map. If the sources of our unhappiness lie in the way we think and relate to experience, then training attention, relaxing reactivity, and cultivating discernment can reverse that pattern. The arena where this map becomes a method is the practice itself, the training of attention, the cultivation of ethical intention, the development of wisdom about the nature of reality. That training is organized through a triad that has both ancient precision and modern resonance: mindfulness, sati, concentration, samadhi, and insight, vipassana. The earliest forms of the path were codified in a way that stressed three interlocking aims: to purify conduct through ethical restraint, to stabilize the mind through sustained attention, and to awaken insight into the impermanent, impersonal, and interdependent character of phenomena. You can hear this triad echoed in the classic formulations of the Satipatthana, the four foundations of mindfulness: mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of the mind, and mindfulness of mental objects. These foundations are not merely techniques for relaxing the mind, they are maps for diagnosing the conditioning of suffering and for discovering a mode of presence that is not simply reactive. Within this framework, two of the most central practices emerge with particular clarity: mindfulness of breathing, anapanasati, and loving-kindness, metta. Anapanasati is perhaps the most famous technique, presented not as a magical shortcut, but as a systematic method for developing both calm, samatha, and discernment, vipassana. The breath serves as a stable, accessible anchor into the present moment, a natural object that invites steady investigation. The practice often unfolds in stages. Observing the breath, noticing the sensation of the air as it enters and leaves, counting breaths, and gradually expanding awareness to the body, the mind, and the contents of consciousness. The aim is not to control the mind by brute force, but to see phenomena as they arise and pass, to observe the conditioning of reactions, and to cultivate a posture of non-identification with mental events. Metta, the practice of loving-kindness, adds a relational dimension to the solitary work of attention. It invites a warm, ethical orientation toward self, toward others, and toward the wider world. When metta is practiced seriously, it is not a sentimentality but a discipline. It asks the mind to cultivate goodwill that is non-grasping, patient, and expansive. A practitioner may begin with phrases like, "May I be happy," "May I be free from suffering," and then extend that intention to loved ones, to strangers, to difficult people, and eventually to all beings. Metta, in this sense, becomes a radical cudgel against the reflex of judgment and aggression, a counter-habit to the default mode of fear, defensiveness, and separation. Vipassana, the insight dimension of practice, seeks to see clearly the conditioned nature of experience: arising, persistence, change, and passing away. Insight in this sense is not merely cognitive understanding. It is experiential, existential recognition of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self. The famous line that frames this project: "All conditioned things are impermanent, all phenomena are not self, and all phenomena are unsatisfactory if clung to," is not just theory. It is a description that becomes a direct experiential insight when one sits with the sensory field, the mood states, the patterns of thought that repeatedly pull one toward craving and avoidance, and the realization that these patterns do not define the self as an unchanging, essential essence. This is why vipassana is often paired with samatha. Concentration is the discipline that quiets mental noise and provides the stability necessary for penetrating insight. The early Buddhist tradition distinguished a path aimed at liberation, nibbana, from a path oriented toward personal well-being within conditioned life. Yet the two trajectories are not mutually exclusive. The ethical training of sila, the precepts and right action, forms the ground on which meditative training can flourish. The monastic codes and the lay ethics of generosity, kindness, and non-harm are not mere social scaffolding. They are prerequisites for a mind that is not constantly pulled by craving, fear, or self-centered strategic thinking. In this sense, the practice is not simply a technique for stress relief, but a form of transformation that reorganizes how one relates to oneself, to others, and to the world at large. Key thinkers and transmissions. Tracing from the early teacher to global networks, if we move from the historical mind of the Buddha to the living lineages and the people who have shaped mindful practice in the modern era, two tasks become clearer. First, there is the immediate transmission of practice, how a set of mental training techniques spread, adapt, and become institutionalized. Second, there is the interpretation of practice, how different teachers emphasize particular aspects, translate technical terms for contemporary audiences, and embed the practice in cultural frames that may be religious, secular, or something in between. In the earliest phase, we speak of the Buddha as the central teacher and the community he convened as the living transmission corridor. The core of his instruction, mindfulness, ethical care, the cultivation of concentration, and the insight into impermanence, passed through generations of mendicants and sages who refined the teaching in various regional languages and cultural settings. The two fundamental strands of meditation that emerged were called samatha, tranquility, and vipassana, clear seeing. Over time, practitioners and teachers elaborated these two into integrated forms. One aspect clarifying the mind's capacity for calm, the other clarifying the true nature of phenomena through direct experience. Moving forward into later centuries, we encounter a different kind of transmission, one that travels across geographical and cultural boundaries with particular emphases. A key figure in this process is Sayagyi Yuba Kin, a Burmese lay practitioner who taught Vipassana meditation in a lay setting and, crucially, mentored his student S.N. Gonka. Gonka personalizes the Vipassana path within a structured retreat format, most famously the 10-day intensives that are offered in centers worldwide. In Gonka's telling and in the practice that thousands have undertaken, Vipassana becomes a discipline of secular clarity, techniques designed to be universally accessible without the need for prior religious commitment. Yet within the training, the ethical posture remains: patience, discipline, and a deep commitment to truth-telling about one's own mental life. In Asia, the late 20th century saw a figure of remarkable influence, Thich Nhat Hanh. A Vietnamese monk and poet, Hanh offered a different vision of mindfulness, one that traveled not only across continents but across social realms. He spoke of mindfulness as a path that could transform social life: mindful listening, mindful speech, mindful action in the service of peace and engaged ethics. His writings, including The Miracle of Mindfulness and Being Peace, became not only manuals for meditation, but callings to reimagine how a mindful life might intersect with politics, education, and communal care. Han's approach often wove together contemplative practice with social responsibility, a form of engaged Buddhism that urged practitioners to bring awareness into the ordinary struggles of family life, work, and public life. In the West, Jon Kabat-Zinn's influence on the secularization and institutionalization of mindfulness is monumental. In 1979, at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, Kabat-Zinn launched a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, MBSR. It was designed not as a religious ritual, but as a non-sectarian, evidence-guided approach to reducing stress, improving attention, and alleviating a range of psychosomatic conditions. The program integrated mindfulness breathing, body awareness, gentle yoga, and inquiry into the patterns of cognitive and emotional response. Its success rippled outward into clinics, workplaces, schools, and eventually into consumer mindfulness apps. Kabat-Zinn's emphasis was on empirical validation and accessibility, a method that could be taught to anyone, regardless of religious identity, with measurable outcomes such as reductions in rumination, improvements in working memory, and decreases in perceived stress. Meanwhile, S.N. Gonka, who carried Vipassana from Burma to the world, helped to seed a global network of centers that hold 10-day courses as their signature format. The approach is characterized by a disciplined, silent retreat environment, a careful instruction in the technique, and a clear emphasis on personal experience rather than doctrinal allegiance. Thich Nhat Hanh's lineage, by contrast, often foregrounds mindfulness as a social art: mindful speech in family life and communities, mindful action in response to conflict and ecological concerns, and the cultivation of compassion through contemplative practice. These various transmissions, Buddha's own instruction, the forest monastery practices that emphasized direct experience, the Vipassana revival in Burma and India, the engagement-oriented spirituality of Thich Nhat Hanh, and the empirical, secularized program that Kabat-Zinn popularized, form a family of practices that share a core impulse: to train attention, soften reactivity, and awaken insight into the nature of experience. They diverge in their emphasis, shrinking the ethical and religious scaffolding, foregrounding social engagement, or prioritizing empirical study and clinical relevance, but they remain connected by a common method: practice as the vehicle of transformation. Two or more additional historical anecdotes illuminate this history. First, the rise of secular mindfulness programs in medicine and education. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, mindfulness entered the medical field as a non-pharmacological intervention for stress, anxiety, chronic pain, and mood disorders. The adoption of MBSR in hospitals, its expansion into cognitive behavioral frameworks like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, and the empirical yield of randomized trials transformed mindfulness from a contemplative discipline into a health tool. A second anecdote concerns Vipassana's global spread through 10-day courses and silent practice. The Dhamma that Gonka and his teachers taught became accessible worldwide, with centers on every continent, often in communities far removed from traditional Buddhist countries. The retreats have created a network of lay practitioners who carry the practice into their workplaces, families, and schools, cultivating a global culture of quiet, disciplined attention. Yet for all the practical appeal of mindfulness as a form of stress relief or performance enhancement, the deeper question remains: what is being cultivated in the heart and life of a practitioner who travels through these programs? The ethical dimension is often the most contested in discussions about secular mindfulness. Does stripping mindfulness of its religious context and ethical precepts diminish its transformative potential, or can it stand as a secularized but still meaningful practice of attention and kindness? We turn now to those arguments, and we offer a careful examination of counterarguments that arise in both the philosophical and scientific discussions surrounding mindfulness. Arguments and counterarguments. The ethical edge and the limits of science. One major counterargument concerns the ethical and spiritual commitments of traditional Buddhism being stripped away in secular mindfulness. Critics worry that by dissociating mindfulness from its ethical framework, from precepts, and from the aim of liberation, secular programs risk producing a tool for personal well-being that leaves intact the social and existential structures that generate suffering. If mindfulness becomes a technique for reducing stress while leaving intact the systems of craving, domination, or inequity, then the practice might alleviate symptoms without challenging the sources of harm. As one scholar-philosopher of religion has put it, mindfulness training can become a technotherapeutic at best and a form of co-opted spiritual practice at worst, if it never asks practitioners to examine the moral and political dimensions of their lives. From within Buddhist criticism, there is concern that removing the ethical context of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path reduces mindfulness to a neutral technique. In early Buddhist texts, practice is inseparable from virtue, right speech, right action, and the cultivation of wholesome states of mind. The mindfulness that is trained in secular programs can, in principle, function without such commitments, but many philosophers and practitioners insist that the ethical ground, compassion, non-harm, generosity, shapes the very object of attention and the quality of understanding that arises through practice. When attention becomes a purely instrumental tool for comfort, efficiency, or productivity, the argument goes, it can lose its transformative potential to reorient desire, to soften self-centered agendas, and to sustain a broader sense of responsibility toward others. A second set of counterarguments centers on overgeneralization and measurement biases in scientific research on meditation outcomes. The enthusiasm around mindfulness in medicine, education, and organizational life rests heavily on reported improvements in attention, mood, pain management, and stress reduction. But critics caution that these effects are often modest, variable, and dependent on context, expectations, and the type of meditation practiced. Some meta-analyses show small to moderate effects with substantial heterogeneity across studies. Others point to potential publication biases, the lack of active control groups in certain trials, and the challenge of isolating specific mechanisms. There is also concern about the mindfulness as panacea narrative that can obscure findings about who benefits most, for whom, and under what conditions. These critiques do not deny the positive potential of mindfulness. They insist on cautious interpretation, transparency about methods, and careful attention to placebo effects, expectancy, and the social determinants of health. A further counterpoint asks whether modern mindfulness, with its emphasis on attention and non-judgment, can ever fully capture the ethical and spiritual depth of the Buddhist path. If one reduces mindfulness to a technique of present-centered awareness, does that risk neglecting the larger horizon of bodhi, awakening, the transformation of character, and a life oriented toward the welfare of all beings? Critics on this front urge a model in which mindfulness remains embedded in a coherent ethical framework, and where the aim of liberation and compassionate action remains central, rather than being diluted into personal well-being or cognitive performance. We can answer these counterarguments by acknowledging their force, while also recognizing the ways in which the modern forms of mindfulness have preserved and adapted crucial elements of the tradition. Ethical precepts and compassionate intention can be reinterpreted, reframed, or reintroduced in secular programs as part of a broader concept of well-being and social responsibility. Early Buddhist scripts describe mindfulness not as a mere technique, but as a discipline of the heart, a phrase that suggests the close alignment of attention with values such as non-harm and generosity. The introduction of compassion and empathetic engagement into mindful practice, often emphasized in the interpretive lineages of Thich Nhat Hanh and in various secular mindfulness curricula, seeks to recover that ethical core. And as for science, the push for rigorous, methodologically sound research is not an enemy of practice but a potential ally. It helps us understand what conditions enable mindfulness to be effective, for whom, and in what contexts, while reminding us of the limits of measurement when it comes to inner change. Two practical, everyday life examples: mindful communication, mindful work, and metta and conflict resolution. Let us translate these discussions into concrete daily life. The first practical example concerns mindful communication in intimate relationships. Imagine two partners in a small, quiet kitchen after a long day. One has come home with a heavy load of work stress, a meeting gone sour, and a mounting sense of not being heard. The other carries a similar load, but the day has left them in a more reactive mood. In such moments, mindfulness does not simply mean calm yourself. It means slowing down the breath, noticing the tendency to interrupt, and choosing a different path. Listening with curiosity, pausing before speaking, naming one's own experience without accusation, and inviting the other to share what matters most. The practice would include steps such as pausing to notice the urge to respond with defensiveness, taking 3 slow breaths, acknowledging the other person's perspective, and speaking from the present moment rather than from a stored grievance. Scientific studies on communication show that such pausing can reduce reactive patterns and increase both empathy and joint problem-solving. In practice, mindfulness of speech helps to reduce knee-jerk judgments and creates a space for mutual understanding to emerge. A second everyday life example centers on mindful work or study habits that reduce reactivity. In a busy office or a graduate program, the mind can be pulled into a tangle of tasks, deadlines, and self-criticism. A simple yet powerful practice is to bring mindfulness to task transitions. Before starting a new task, pause, take a breath, and ask what the most important purpose of this task is. Observe the impulse to multitask as a strategy to avoid discomfort, and then intentionally choose one focus for a defined period. During the work itself, employ mindful momentum. Short, deliberate checks on posture, breathing, and attention, a willingness to notice wandering thoughts without judgment and to gently return to the task. The effect, observed in many MBCT/MBSR studies, is a reduction in cognitive and emotional reactivity. Fewer negative ruminations after setbacks, steadier attention, and a greater capacity to sustain effort over time. This is not simply being calmer. It is about aligning intention with action, so that energy spent on self-criticism or misaligned priorities can be redirected toward clear, purposeful work. A third example, the metta practice in conflict resolution, takes us from the inner life to social life. Imagine a dispute between colleagues whose histories are entangled with bias and frustration. Metta practice in this setting becomes a method of cultivating a nonviolent, expansive stance that seeks to release grudges and replace them with goodwill and humane intention. The core phrases of metta, "May all beings be happy," "May all beings be free from suffering," are not merely generic wishes but a practical reorientation. We begin with the self and extend outward through the sphere of social life. In conflict resolution, metta can serve as a design for dialogue, an invitation to recognize the humanity of all participants, to acknowledge the pain and fear that underwrite anger, and to generate a creative openness to new possibilities for cooperation and healing. In practice, metta-based conflict resolution involves listening deeply to grievances without becoming defensive, naming the shared vulnerability behind the dispute, and proposing concrete steps that honor the dignity of everyone involved. In settings such as organizations, schools, and community groups, metta-informed approaches have been shown to reduce aggression, increase the willingness to engage with opposing viewpoints, and foster collaborative problem-solving. Anecdotes of practice in history and culture that illuminate everyday life to ground these practices in lived histories. Consider 2 historical anecdotes that reflect the broad arc of integration from temple halls to clinics, classrooms, and interfaith gatherings. First, the rise of secular mindfulness programs in medicine and education. In the late 20th century, medical centers and research universities began to propose that mindfulness could become a measurable contributor to health and well-being. The establishment of MBSR in 1979, with its 8-week program structured around mindfulness meditation, body awareness, gentle yoga, and group discussions, offered a framework that clinicians could use with patients who faced chronic pain, anxiety, and stress-related illnesses. The effect was not merely to calm patients, but to equip them with a set of skills for observing their own responses to pain, to fear, and to uncertainty, an empowerment in the face of suffering rather than a suppression of it. The broader educational movement followed as schools and universities began to incorporate mindfulness into curricula. The anecdotal impact, students reporting improved concentration, teachers noting reduced classroom turbulence, and administrators pursuing mindfulness as a way to cultivate school climate, signaled a shift in the culture of education. Mindfulness is not a luxury but a resource for daily functioning and relational health. Second, the global spread of Vipassana retreats. The Vipassana movement, with centers worldwide offering long courses in silent retreat, has established a network of practice that sorely tests cultural boundaries. In a retreat hall, participants sit in silence for days, sometimes weeks, and learn to observe sensation, mood, and thought without becoming attached to them. The story of these centers, often in rural settings, sometimes in urban centers housed in renovated monasteries or community spaces, speaks to a universal appeal. A form of inner discipline that promises clarity of mind amid the noise of modern life. The global spread is not only a matter of geographical reach, but also of cultural translation. How does a practice rooted in ancient Indian and Southeast Asian contexts speak to professionals in New York, students in Sao Paulo, laypeople in Lagos, caregivers in Seoul? The answer lies in the adaptability of the method, its secularized forms, its emphasis on personal experience, and its insistence that one can begin anywhere with a breath, a posture, an intention to see clearly. Cross-references. Cognitive science, Stoicism, and Christian contemplative paths on the contemporary side. Secular cognitive science and psychology provide a parallel language for understanding what mindfulness does. The evidence base has grown to show that mindfulness training can improve attention, reduce rumination, lower stress markers, and alter neural functioning in networks associated with self-referential processing and emotion regulation. The implications for education, healthcare, and workplaces are substantial. Yet this science does not simply validate the practice. It also challenges us to ask why these effects occur, under what conditions, and for whom. It invites careful, transparent debates about methodology, effect sizes, and real-world significance. The best researchers recognize that mindfulness is a set of interrelated processes: attention regulation, body awareness, emotion regulation, and values-based action that can operate differently across individuals and contexts. When we acknowledge these complexities, we can avoid both the overenthusiasm that promises effortless transformation and the cynical dismissal that reduces meditation to a mere gadget of productivity. A parallel tradition that speaks to the same issues is Stoicism. Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius urged a gentleness of mind toward what cannot be controlled, a disciplined attention to one's own judgments, and a steadfast commitment to virtue in daily life. The Stoic practice of the mindful management of impressions, for instance, has a striking kinship with Buddhist notions of non-attachment to mental states and a readiness to respond rather than to react. The Stoics may not have used modern terminology like resilience or emotion regulation, but their emphasis on training the mind to see things as they are, to distinguish between what one can and cannot control, and to align action with a rationally examined good, resonates with many of the same aims of mindfulness-based practices. Christian contemplative practices offer another set of cross-currents. Contemplative prayer, centering prayer, and various forms of silent contemplation in Christian traditions emphasize the discernment of attention, the listening of the heart, and the cultivation of a presence that is open to the divine or to a transcendent sense of value. The practice of attention in Christian contemplatives, often described as a gaze directed toward love, parallels mindfulness in its insistence on non-judging awareness and an openness to experience as it presents itself. Writers like St. Augustine, the medieval mystics, and later contemplatives such as Thomas Merton and Teresa of Avila explored attention, interior conversion, and the ethical implications of attentional life in ways that intersect with Buddhist concerns about mental habits, virtue, and the transformation of the self. In these cross-references, the question arises not as a binary opposition of religions, but as a broad conversation about how attention, care, and virtue can be cultivated across different spiritual languages. Quotes from primary sources, anchors and reminders to ground our discussion in the living words of Buddhist sources. Here are a few widely cited lines that have carried through centuries of practice, translated in ways that reflect canonical concerns while acknowledging translation variability. From the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, the Buddha's exposition of the Four Noble Truths. Now this is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. To be bound to what is unpleasant is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In short, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. These lines function here as a diagnostic of human experience and a map for practice. They tell us what we're dealing with and what the cure might look like. From the Dhammapada, a book of verses that is often read as a distilled essence of the Buddha's ethical philosophy, we hear this. All conditioned things are impermanent. This is a foundational recognition that fosters renunciation and a more adaptive relationship to desire and fear. In the same collection, we encounter a more empowering admonition about our own mental life. Mind precedes all mental states, mind is their chief. If with a pure mind one speaks or acts, happiness follows them, like a never-departing shadow. This line, quoted in many translations, captures the intimate link between intention, attention, and action, a link that practice seeks to strengthen. From the Metta Sutta, a canonical text on loving kindness, we have the reminder that enfolded within the practice of goodwill is a radical social intent. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free from suffering. And a line that invites practical transformation in how we treat others. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Be compassionate and practice kindness in your conduct. Metta is not simply a mood. It is a discipline that shapes speech, intention, and the atmosphere of interpersonal encounters. From the Satipatthana Sutta, Teachings on the Four Foundations, we receive a precise invitation to observe carefully. And how bhikkhus does a bhikkhu live ardent, fully aware, and mindful? He abides contemplating the body in the body, and he contemplates feelings, the mind, and the phenomena. The passage conveys that mindfulness is not merely a mental technique, but a structured practice of investigation, an ongoing conversation with each aspect of experience. From Thich Nhat Hanh and other modern interpreters, we encounter paraphrastic, yet deeply resonant formulations tied to ancient tests of attention and compassion. Breath is the bridge which connects life to consciousness, which unites your body to your thoughts. This line, while not a canonical Pali phrase, captures a Thai, Vietnamese, and Chinese interpretive tradition that translates ancient insights into present-day lived experience. In a similar spirit, the metta practice, though preserved in canonical forms, remains a living injunction to cultivate a heart that is spacious, patient, and oriented toward repair of harm. Analogies. Making sense of practice through imagery to render the practice accessible in everyday language, consider a few analogies that recur in the teaching tradition. The lighthouse in the fog. Mindfulness is like a lighthouse that shines its beam through the fog of our mental weather. The sea of sensation, thought, fear, and desire churns, but the light, sustained attention helps a ship know where it is and where it is headed. When storms arise, the lighthouse does not banish them. It keeps showing the safe channel, the useful direction, the rock-free path where one can avoid needless collision with the reefs of reactivity, tuning a radio in the noise. The mind in daily life is like a radio receiver trying to pick up a clear signal amid static. Mindfulness is the process of adjusting the dial, recognizing the presence of static, and learning to maintain a stable signal long enough to hear the message that matters. The more precisely you tune, the less you are carried away by the hiss of fear or the loudness of craving. The garden and the gardener. Samatha can be seen as the gardener's drill, learning to tend the soil of the mind so that the plants of awareness, clarity, and balance can grow. Vipassana is the gardener's careful inspection, seeing which plants sprout, which soil is nourishing, which weeds, craving, aversion, and delusion need deliberate removal. The garden thrives when the gardener learns to be patient, to align attention with the slow work of growth, and to attend to the whole landscape without fixating on any single plant. Historical anecdotes again illuminate how the practice has moved through time and space. The rise of secular mindfulness in medicine and education shows how a discipline rooted in the Buddhist tradition can become a shared human language of attention, emotion regulation, and well-being, accessible to people who may not identify with Buddhism or any religion at all. In hospital wards, in counseling rooms, and in schools, mindfulness offers a structured set of exercises, a secular vocabulary for describing attention, and an evidence base that supports its role in improving focus, reducing stress, and fostering self-regulation. The global spread of Vipassana retreats demonstrates a different kind of movement, religiously tinged, yet broadly inclusive. The silent 10-day course is designed to be accessible to laypeople and non-Buddhists, yet remains anchored in a lineage that values direct experience, the integrity of practice, and a rigorous standard of self-observation. The result is a network that crosses borders, languages, and religious affiliations, creating communities of practitioners who share a common discipline, an experiential tradition that binds people with very different backgrounds into a shared practice of attention and compassion. Search for depth, cross-referencing knowledge, method, and moral aim in approaching Buddha's mindfulness. There is a natural impulse to connect the practice to other ways of thinking about attention and virtue. Secular cognitive science and psychology, with its emphasis on attention networks, executive function, and emotion regulation, offers a contemporary vocabulary for assessing how mindfulness works. It helps explain why a practice that involves monitoring breathing, body states, and mental content can yield improvements in concentration and a reduction in rumination. At the same time, it invites questions about what mindfulness can and cannot deliver, whether it can produce durable changes or whether its effects depend on ongoing practice, intention, and social context. It also invites reflection on the quality of attention. Is one cultivating a non-judgmental, compassionate stance toward one's experiences, or is the aim purely to optimize performance or appearance? In the same moment, Stoicism presents a parallel, gentle discipline of the mind. The Stoics' insistence on distinguishing between what one can control and what one cannot, their practice of reframing impressions, and their ethical call to live in accordance with reason and virtue resonates with Buddhist attention and discernment. The Stoic call for inner resilience, remaining calm and virtuous amid adversity, parallels the Buddhist aim of liberation from suffering through the transformation of mental habits. If mindfulness trains attention and contact with reality in a way that softens reactivity, then Stoicism trains judgment and action in a way that aligns with virtue. The two traditions approach the life of the mind from complementary angles. One shapes the interior field of awareness, the other shapes the practical posture toward life's challenges. Christian contemplative practices offer another lens. The contemplative path, centering prayer, the practice of lectio divina, or contemplative reading, emphasizes attention and interior stillness as a route to transformation. In this sense, Christian contemplatives contribute a language of surrender, trust, and the longing for union with something greater than the ego, which can be deeply resonant for those seeking meaning, dignity, and ethical integrity in a secular age. The cross-cultural dialogue among mindfulness, Stoicism, and Christian contemplation invites a broader conversation about what attention is for: a tool for personal well-being, a pathway to moral discernment, or a doorway to a liberating encounter with reality. Two more insights about the practice, and two more quotes from the Buddha's own tradition, will serve to ground our exploration in lived experience and canonical authority. A note on the ethical core and the social horizon: practice is not a private affair alone. In the Buddhist tradition, even the deepest meditative insights have social and ethical dimensions. Mindfulness becomes ethically meaningful when it is yoked to compassion, kindness, and a commitment to reducing harm. In the Theravada and Mahayana lineages, the emphasis on right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and right effort keeps the practice tethered to a humane and socially responsible life. In contemporary settings, there is a continuous negotiation about how to maintain that ethical horizon when mindfulness is offered in corporate environments, in schools, or as a therapy for individual distress. Yet the ethical dimension remains alive in the practice communities that insist that mindfulness is never simply about me, but about how one relates to others, to the community, and to the wider world. Two brief quotes that anchor this sense of ethical life emerge from primary sources. First, the unity of practice and virtue in the Pali tradition is echoed by the exhortation that mindfulness should be paired with ethical conduct, speech that is truthful, kindly, and beneficial. The teaching is clear: to train the mind without training the heart would be an incomplete project. Second, the Metta Suta's call to universal goodwill extends not only to meditation sessions, but to real-world conflict and harm, inviting practitioners to translate inner peace into outward acts of peace. These lines remind us that the Buddha's path is not just about quieting the mind, but about cultivating a mode of being that can stand up to the suffering of the world with courage, patience, and care. The modern reception. A cross-cultural, cross-temporal fusion of inner path and outer life. In sum, the Buddha's mindfulness, whether practiced in the monastic silence of a Burmese forest, in a Western clinic, in a classroom, or in a family kitchen, emerges as a capacity for attention that is ethically formed, psychologically informed, and socially engaged. It is a practice that can be learned by anyone in any context, yet it carries the freight of a long spiritual and philosophical tradition. The transmission across Asia to the West, and within the West from clinical settings to public life, reveals not a single uniform form, but a spectrum of practices with shared roots and diverse expressions. The question then is not simply whether mindfulness works, but how a given practice integrates attention training, ethical intention, and social intention to transform life at the level of heart, mind, and action. As you reflect on the road from the Buddha's awakening to the contemporary mindfulness movement, hold this image in your mind. Mindfulness is not a magic trick. It is a discipline akin to learning an instrument or training a body. The notes you can play depend on the depth of your listening, the steadiness of your breath, the willingness to meet discomfort without collapsing into it, and the generosity of your attention toward others. It is a practice of becoming more present to reality as it is, not as you wish it to be, and it is the kind of presence that, in the best cases, ripples outward as gentleness, clarity, and compassion. Now let us return to the everyday, to the concrete, to the people who practice mindfulness while balancing work, family, and social obligations. Let us visit the kitchen, the conference room, the classroom, the courtroom, and the quiet center within the heart. Let us listen to the breath of life itself, the breath that anchors the present moment and in doing so, sustains a life of care, courage, and wisdom. The journey from anapanasati to metta, from vipassana to daily life, is not a straight line but a spiral that returns again and again to the same core question. What is the mind being trained for, and how does that training bear on the suffering that surrounds us? If you want a practical synthesis to carry into your week, here is a simple invitation. Begin by naming the 4 foundations to yourself in everyday language. On waking, bring mindful attention to your body as you move through the day. Notice any areas of tension or discomfort and breathe into them with curiosity, not self-judgment. Observe the feelings that arise in response to events at work or at home, and try to differentiate the sensations from the stories you tell about them. Practice metta in a small, sustainable way. One person at a time, one encounter at a time, one day at a time. When conflict arises, rehearse a metta-based response, a moment to offer goodwill toward the other, to recognize their humanity, and to imagine a constructive path forward. In moments of difficulty, lean on the breath as a steady anchor that helps you choose response over reactivity, clarity over reaction. The journey from ancient texts to modern laboratories and from silent retreat halls to bustling classrooms is a long one, but it remains, at its heart, a single journey. That of attention becoming a friend, a guide, and a teacher. It is a journey toward a mind that can stay with experience without being overwhelmed by it, that can hold a vision of greater flourishing for oneself and for others, and that can bring the light of discernment into the ordinary operations of daily life. The Buddha's path in this telling is not a distant doctrine but an active practice, available to anyone who is ready to begin with a single breath, and available to everyone who is willing to let that breath lead them toward a more kind, attentive, and awake life. If you take away one idea from this exploration, let it be this: mindfulness is a practice of presence that is not passive but transformative. It asks us to slow down just enough to see what is true, to attend to what is happening with honesty, and to respond with intention rather than reactivity. It invites us to find a way of living in which attention itself becomes a form of virtue, an instrument of care for ourselves, others, and the world. In that sense, the Buddha's teaching does not retreat into another private technique. It enters into our common life as a discipline of stewardship over the mind, a practice that can enrich relationships, workplaces, schools, and communities by making everyday life a school for virtue and a workshop for wisdom. Thank you for listening. May your practice begin again in this moment, and may it unfold with patience, clarity, and kindness. May it help you live with less reactivity, more responsiveness, and a deeper sense of connection to the life around you. It is, after all, practice with a purpose that extends beyond the self, toward a life that matters to others and to the world.